on defence, but I don't agree with cutting spending on things that will lead to the need for more defence, namely migration, civil wars, and the rest of it. Now, as has been pointed out by my right honourable friend, by the honourable lady who's just spoke from Rotherham, by the Leader of the Opposition, the government's proposed double lock on returning to 0.7% is deceptive. It's designed to look reasonable. But in fact, none of the people who have spoken so far actually stated the full case. Because although it's only been met once since 1990 under a Conservative government, and never been met really once just about under the government since the policy 0.7% policy was put in place, in fact it's never been met. It's actually never been met since 1970, because what the wording says is not a current budget surplus, but a sustainable current budget surplus. And all the current budget surplus we've been talking about so far have been 1 year. And frankly, the one under us in 2018 was 1 year for about 10 nanoseconds. It was a very, very tiny surplus. In practice, since the 1970s, we've not had a sustainable current surplus. So I'm afraid, under the actual wording in the statement, we're not looking at this for a very long time indeed. We've heard the Leader of the Opposition said years, possibly decades, possibly never, and I think he's right about that. Now, the proposal won't do anything, even if it were to be met, even if the conditions were met, to deal with the crises that are caused by the policy already, right now. The government argues the cuts are temporary, but death is never temporary. It causes deaths.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Since ministers announced that the UK was going to be the only G7 country to cut its aid this year, despite all of those other countries facing the same fiscal pressures, there's not one member of this House who is not now aware of the consequences of the decision that ministers have taken. A cut of 85% in the support that we give to the United Nations Population Fund to prevent maternal child death and unwanted pregnancy. A cut of 95% to the Global Polio Eradication Initiative at the very moment when the world is closer than it has ever been to eradicating this dreadful disease. And a cut of 50% in the support we give to the Mine Humanitarian Action Programme, which stops people losing their arms, their legs and their lives to unexploded ordnance. It's a very long list. And every one of those things harms our reputation and doesn't help us to persuade others, because other countries judge us not by what we say, but by what we do. And therefore the choice before the House today is a very stark one. Do we act to put this right, or do we accept the double lock that has been proposed? And I urge the House to reject it, because there's a principle here. What is it about the level of government spending on helping the world's poorest people that it alone is going to be subject to these tests? No other area of government expenditure, just this one. If this is about protecting the public finances, then why is this area of government expenditure, which is the money we spend on getting children into school or vaccinating children so they don't die of diseases that our children do not die of, why is it being singled out? Now, I have great admiration for the OBR, but determining the level of our international aid spending is not part of its responsibility. It is the government's responsibility. It is a political responsibility, and ministers should not try and pass the buck on to someone else, especially when, if you read the latest OBR forecast, it is exceedingly unlikely that the two tests would be met in the next 5 years. I will give way, of course.
I'm grateful. Can I just pick him up on that point about other areas of expenditure? It seems to me that the Treasury and the Chancellor, having set out these tests, which are in our manifesto, and we mean to keep them, is that the comprehensive spending review that's taking place this year, it seems to me we will be judging all other areas of government expenditure by these measures, and I see the Chancellor nodding. So it seems to me that we're being very consistent here And I think it's important that we keep these promises about our fiscal responsibilities as well as getting back on track to meeting our aid responsibilities.
Well, I'm afraid, I say to the right honourable gentleman, I take a different view of the government's consistency because it has chosen quite specifically and knowingly and deliberately to break a cast iron promise that was also contained in that manifesto to the world's poorest people. And as I said in my last contribution on this subject, most of them probably got no idea that this House had made that commitment together, but the government has chosen to do that. And the choice we're making today is, do we think that's right or do we think that is wrong? And I would say to the Chancellor, if he thinks the double lock is a way out of the political problem, I don't think it isn't, because the issue that is before us hasn't gone away. It's just the same as it was the day the original cut was announced. And the question is this: is it right morally, practically, politically to break our word to the world's poorest people? That's the question that is before us. Well, I would argue that it isn't. It's wrong in principle. It is harmful in practice, as we've heard from the excellent speeches on the benches opposite. It is not, I think, who we are. It is not the country that we should aspire to be. And I ask the House to reject the motion so we can restore aid to 0.7% and keep the promise that we made to the people of this country and the people of the world.
Pauline Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise really very sadly today because I stood on a manifesto along with everybody else that we would honour that 0.7%, and I was there when we voted on it originally. The people that we are trying to protect have already been hit because our economy went down during the beginning of the COVID pandemic. They're going to be hit, or they continue to be hit again with this reduction to 0.5%, because 0.7% of a figure is a lot more than 0.7%. So we've gone down a huge amount already, and the people are suffering. If we take just a random family with 2 parents and maybe 6 children, 4 of whom are boys and 2 are girls, the girls will be the ones who have less food and they would benefit from nutritional programs that we provide, but we won't be providing those. The girls would normally get that because the boys are usually prioritised in many families and they would probably go to school, whereas the girls won't be able to go to school because they won't have the funding to be able to afford it. And the Prime Minister has stood so often on the promise that he will educate all girls with 12 years of quality education. Well, no matter how he protests, that is not going to happen now. And I feel that we are letting down the poorest people in the world. We are just devastating their futures for £4 billion, which we've heard is 1% of what's already been borrowed. It's not a lot of money, and we borrowed that money, and as has been said by many, those people who we should be benefiting will not benefit. They won't have the malaria treatments, they won't have all the neglected tropical disease treatments, they won't have all the help, and especially they will have earlier marriages, they will have younger pregnancies, because we are cutting devastating figures of 85% of the family planning budget and the abortion budget, and that is going to devastate many girls. Many girls will die in early childbirth because of this decision by this government. So I find it shocking that this government is doing that. We are a Conservative government. We decided to spend the 0.7%. We legislated for it, and we are letting those very poorest people down. And I don't see how anybody who has heard the speeches today could vote in all conscience to support what the government want to do with this double lock, because we will never get back to 0.7%.
Go to Wendy Chamberlain. Wendy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to you and members from across this House for their perseverance on this issue. Now, when the government announced last summer that DFID would merge with the then Foreign Commonwealth Office, I and my fellow Liberal Democrats warned of the risk to overseas development assistance and funding. I asked an urgent question to the Foreign Secretary, and I wrote to the DFID Secretary of State on these very issues. And the Secretary of State said at the time, and I quote, "We are committed to the 0.7% of GNI commitment. We want the aid budget and the development know-how and expertise that we have in DFID. It has done a fantastic job at the beating heart of our international decision-making processes." But here we are, Mr. Speaker, 1 year later, and having claimed just last week that the opportunity to vote on this cut to ODA spending had been lost by not being called in the recent Estimates Day debate, I wonder what has caused the government to change its mind and bring forward today's debate at such short notice. Economic circumstances caused by COVID are not the fault of the world's poorest, and we and the many, many charities and NGOs who have contacted me in advance of today's debate know that the poorest will be hardest hit by these cuts. The reality of the COVID pandemic is that no one is safe until everyone is safe. Part of this is sharing of urgently needed vaccines around the world, but it is not only this. We know that global inequalities, that poverty mean that people around the world cannot take the precautions to protect themselves. We can't expect those without access to clean water, 785 million at last count in 2017, to be able to wash their hands for 20 seconds. Slashing development spending is deeply harmful to the notion of global Britain and to us at home. And, Mr. Speaker, it's that this cuts to these fundings also mean cuts to spending within the UK that I think is sometimes lost. ODA funding goes to many places, including our universities who are doing research into how best to tackle the entrenched causes of global inequality and how to support developing countries in order to be self-sufficient. St Andrews University, in my own constituency, is looking up to 50% cuts to some of their active projects, which will impact on the poorest today. These cuts harm not only those in need around the world, but our own research and innovation industries, vital in our response to Brexit and facing the climate crisis. Turning to the government's update, the fiscal tests for development spending presented today are the height of cynicism. They're designed never to be met. As others have said, we have only met these tests once in this century. Conservative MPs must know that by supporting today's motion, it means not returning to 0.7 in this Parliament. And that means that every one of them that supports the government today will be breaking their manifesto promise for 5 years in a row. It's a straight choice. Do we return to 0.7 as we were all elected to this place to do, or do we fail to be the global leaders that the UK has been to this point on this issue? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm delighted to be called, and I pay enormous tribute to my right honourable friend who's sitting on the front bench today. The Chancellor demonstrated during his career before reaching this place that you can do well by doing good. In working for the Children Investment Fund Management, he proved that finance, that capitalism can support the world and actually change lives. But he will also recognise that even an impressive fund like that, built off a stable platform, governments, guaranteed by organisations, international bodies and others. And that's why I'm very sorry that I will not be able to support him today, because that platform today is what is so important. That confidence, that ability to rely on a stable platform for the future is absolutely essential. Instead of having that continuity and instead of having that guarantee of an enduring future, we're going sadly back towards the yo-yo policy. Well, that's not just bad because of the variability. It's bad because it costs more and delivers less. It's frankly inefficient, it is an error, and it undermines our capability. Now, nobody in this House is more passionate about global Britain or Britain's place in the world than me. Nobody believes more that we should have a place at every table, that we should have a voice in every room. But we need to know that we are no longer buying that with gunboats, but with the aid and the effectiveness that we bring.
On that point, the honourable and gallant member is making a very impressive speech, and he talks about global Britain. The point of global Britain is about diplomacy, it is about trade, it is about aid, it is about defence. These four things are interconnected to one another. If you reduce one, you have an impact on all, and that is something that will be detrimental from everything from the integrated review to our outside approach.
My honourable member is completely correct, and of course the reality is that we're not living in a vacuum here. We're not taking these decisions with nobody watching. The reality is that our friends are watching and our rivals are watching. As we make this decision and as we change our policy on Afghanistan, as we buy different seats at various UN tables through the diplomacy that we do in sub-Saharan Africa, in Asia and South America, we know that we are changing the rules by which we live. We are literally changing the standards of our modern world by how we buy support, how we develop allies, and how we partner around the world. This, and many people have already spoken about, is of course about the world's poorest. But it's not just about the world's poorest. It's fundamentally about Britain. It's how do we protect ourselves? How do we shape this world? How do we get the standards that make sure British businesses succeed, that make sure British finance shapes the world, that make sure that British rules are those the world lives by? And we do that by making sure we win the votes at the UN, by making sure that we have the voices around the table, that we have the voices of the foreign ministers of countries around the world. Now, we can do it, and I can tell you why we can do it. I can tell you that I know we can do it, because we have done it. For 20 years, we have won debates, we have shaped arguments, and we have defended our position. And we have done it by doing well, by doing good, exactly as the Chancellor demonstrated in his pre-political career. Now, I can understand why the government might say that actually these targets, these ambitions are too high and that they wish to send a different spending limit. I can understand that. But that's not the argument the government's making. The argument the government's making is the Augustine argument. Lord, make me chaste, but not just yet. Well, if you wish to be holy, choose sanctity. If you wish not to be frank with what you are choosing.
We now go to Liam Byrne.
That was a great speech, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow it. The House doesn't need a former Chief Secretary to the Treasury to lay out that today's motion is a con job, but I'm going to explain that anyway. The Red Book, published in the last budget, shows that public sector net debt is not falling until 2024 at the earliest. But there's no way that a Chancellor, or a Chief Secretary, in fact, would ever make a judgment about whether it was falling sustainably on 1 year alone. That means that this cut is now forecast to stretch way into the next Parliament. And yet the sums we're talking about here are just 0.14% of the national debt stock. And they come at a time when we are putting up defence spending by £24 billion and yet entail a cut of £4 billion to aid spending. We are boasting about our soft power, superpower status, and then slashing into the budget that actually delivers us that soft power. You judge a country's values by its budget, and this aid cut tells you everything you need to know about this government's priorities. The second point I want to make, though, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that this aid cut will cost lives and it will cost livelihoods. The Prime Minister sailed into the G7 very proud of his declaration that he wanted to jab the world and make sure that by the end of next year, the world was safe from COVID. But look, by the end of the G7, the IMF itself was saying that we're something like $23 billion short of what we need for a global vaccination program. This aid cut is not going to help that. It's going to hurt that effort to jab the world. But second, we have got a significant problem now getting the world back on its feet after this pandemic. The IMF thinks that we need something like $200 billion extra in spending to protect the world against COVID and $250 billion of extra investment in climate-friendly investment to help safeguard the recovery. How is this aid cut going to help with that great global project that we've now got to attend to for the years ahead? It's not. It's going to damage the world's efforts to get there, and it's going to damage our efforts to help persuade others to get to that big target. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is 36 years to the day when we celebrated Live Aid. It was an example of how we in this country set out to lead the world to help the world's poorest. On this day of all days, the government is now set to surrender that leadership. We cannot have a rules-based order if we have a Prime Minister who continues to shred the rules. This is a renegade act by a renegade government, and I'll be voting against this motion tonight.
Jeremy Wright.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. There are, I think, two primary arguments for opposing the government this afternoon. The first is that the 0.7% overseas aid target was a manifesto commitment, and that is a serious point, though I do think the electorate will appreciate the expectations on which those manifestos were based have changed substantially since COVID-19. But the second is that the target is in statute in the International Development Official Development Assistance Target Act of 2015. And that is true. But the Act also envisages and allows for circumstances in which the government might not meet the target in any given year, including the impact on public borrowing. And Parliament cannot stop the government doing so. The Act at Section 3, subsection 1 is very clear about that. We only have the right to be informed of how and why the target is to be missed. And as far as I can tell, Madam Deputy Speaker, nobody is proposing to amend the 2015 Act, so it will remain unchanged, whatever the vote this afternoon. Now, I welcome the government's clarification that it is not seeking unilaterally to change the statutory target, but rather to miss it. Those are different things, and the former would, in my view, be both wrong and unlawful. But you either, Madam Deputy Speaker, trust the government or you don't. If you don't trust the government, and we are here because a large number of members do not, then why would you trust it to keep the 0.7% commitment beyond next year when the Act so clearly allows it to decide not to? Transparent, externally judged criteria, arguably at least, would leave those of us who want to see the preservation of aid spending in a stronger position than under the 2015 Act alone, which applies what are in truth fairly loose shackles to government on aid spending and leaves it entirely to government to decide when to escape them. And that cannot help provide the certainty that the aid sector rightly seeks. Madam Deputy Speaker, I believe in the merits of overseas aid spending, and I've used many of the arguments made so eloquently by my right honourable friend for Sutton Coldfield, who deserves, in my view, huge credit for extracting the compromises the government has already made. But these arguments have, in the end, to persuade the public, whose money we are, after all, spending. As Conservatives, we also argue that high public debt is bad for our long-term capacity to support the vulnerable everywhere. And I think enduring public support for aid spending may well depend on the public recognising that we have apportioned the financial burden of the COVID crisis fairly and not protected aid spending to the detriment of other areas of spending they may find at least as deserving. Now, I think the government is now trying to strike that balance. And recognising, though I do, the strength of the arguments made by many on both sides of this House in the course of this debate, I think it important and necessary to give them credit for that effort.
Sam Tarry.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The government's decision to renege on its international obligations rides roughshod over those ring-fence commitments and puts at risk millions across the globe. It's not in our national interest, and it's certainly not in our national security interest to do that, and that's before we even take into consideration our moral duty as a nation to alleviate global poverty. And damningly, several former Prime Ministers who themselves proudly upheld our country's aid commitments have also voiced their concerns about this government's handling of its international aid obligations. Indeed, you heard earlier today, the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead has committed to voting against a 3-line Conservative whip for the first time ever. So powerfully does she feel about this issue. And when the Right Honourable Member spoke in this debate, she was crystal clear what the aid cuts would mean when she said fewer girls will be educated, more boys and girls will become slaves, more children will go hungry, and more of the poorest people in the world will die. A damning indictment from a former Conservative Prime Minister. The UK has a long and proud track record of stepping up and supporting those in need. We cannot abandon our responsibilities to those around the world who are most poverty-stricken, least of all now in a global pandemic. The UK is currently the only G7 country to commit in legislation to spending 0.7% of gross national income on international development, a target set by the United Nations, and is the second largest international development donor behind only the US. And that is right and proper, that is a fact. The extended families of many of my Ilford South constituents directly benefit from UK aid, lifting millions of their extended families out of illiteracy, poverty, and providing so much support to some of the poorest communities around the globe, including Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, and Sri Lanka. However, instead of leading by example, This government has now shamefully been the only G7 nation to cut its aid budget this year. There could be no clearer argument against cutting aid than the devastating impact of the COVID response. In April this year, the Delta variant was ravaging India. Vital coronavirus research centres, including Project Tracking Variants in India, had its funding reduced by up to 70%, leading its project lead to say the cut would not only make vitally important projects unviable, but in effect would kill it dead. Then in May, the Tropical Health and Education Trust criticised the UK government for slashing £48 million in global healthcare funding as part of its wider cuts. Indeed, those plans to donate 6 million items of PPE ordered by the British NHS to healthcare workers fighting new variants across the world were held up, yet again preventing a containment of the virus. We have a duty to act, Madam Deputy Speaker. We must do so now before it's too late for millions who rely on that direct aid. This is not about giving a man a fish to feed himself, but giving a net to provide for himself. It's about enabling, indeed, our historic obligation to lift up the global south using our nation's far greater resources. I welcome the actions of our colleagues on the opposite side of the House who will today vote with us in voting against this callous and awful manoeuvre by the government.
Bim Afalami.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This is a very difficult debate today, Madam Deputy Speaker, because we all on both sides of the House know what good UK aid spending does. We are all proud of what we've been able to achieve with our aid spending. And it doesn't just help in and of itself, it also helps the British taxpayer, it helps British people, because by investing in areas like education and vaccination and supporting local economies, we stop some of those problems washing up to British shores, and we understand that. But this debate is really about, when you get underneath all of it, it's really about competing political necessities, competing political choices. On the one hand, we have a real need as a responsible government in fiscal terms, as we come out of the COVID pandemic, of which we already know how many hundreds of billions has been spent. There's a need to make sure that we get our day-to-day spending, our current spending, back in balance. There's a need to make sure that our debt ends up falling as a percentage of GDP, because that public spending that is only necessary, which is only possible when those things are there, is what supports all of the vulnerable people in this country, all British taxpayers everywhere, as much as poorest people in the world with aid spending. But at the same time, there is also a need to make sure we help the poorest people in the world. And that is the balance that we are trying to strike here. And I believe the government has struck the right one. Now, there have been some members have talked about the fiscal, these tests that the government has set, and somehow have suggested that they've only been met once in the last 20 years. I've actually taken a look at this. Both tests have been met the year 2000 to 2001, 2001 to 2002, 2018 to 2019. And if I'm right, though the Chancellor may correct me if I'm wrong, the underlying debt in the years before the pandemic fell for, I think, 4 years in a row. So it is not true that somehow these are impossible tests. But even if you didn't believe me, Madam Deputy Speaker, the key part of this, and why I respect and accept this compromise position, is that these are transparent and clear criteria. Everybody knows what it is. We can judge it independently, and the OBR, as we all know and trust, is an organisation perfectly capable of doing that. And the last thing I'll say is, it's not just important how much money we spend. It's also important how we spend it. What I'd like to see with our aid budget is more of that money, not just with multinationals, which does a lot of good work, but smaller charities working on the ground. Charities like Harpend and Spotlight on Africa, based in my constituency, that does fantastic work in rural Uganda, because having seen the work they do on the ground, working with bigger multinationals and the Ugandan government, can do fantastic things. And I'd like to see that spend that we have at 0.5% temporarily, that spend go more to some of those grassroots organisations, so we can spend our money even more effectively so that we get more for what we're doing.
Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I would like to say it's a pleasure to speak in this debate, but that would not be true, because I am appalled that we're having to vote on this proposal at all. This cut to our international aid budget reflects badly on us all, not just this government, and portrays the UK as inward-looking and self-serving. This is a Tory manifesto promise that is going to be broken, and broken very publicly, as the whole world is watching. I wonder how the Prime Minister will have the bottle to attend COP26 and call for other countries to raise finances for climate action when he's in charge of a government that's cutting its own contribution. Surely the ultimate act of hypocrisy. Madam Deputy Speaker, if this overseas aid funding was going to finance vanity projects, trips to the moon or high-flying, cutting-edge, dodgy ventures, then I could begin to understand the reasoning behind the decision. But none of the projects fall into those categories. They are basic health and social care projects that currently benefit millions of people across the poorer countries on our planet. The money funds basic projects like polio eradication, sexual health advice, the clearing of landmines, education programmes, the provision of clean water and sanitation, the prevention of sexual exploitation of women and girls. The money funds training programmes like the NHS Overseas Training Scheme, which trained 78,000 healthcare workers in Nepal, Uganda, Ethiopia, Bangladesh and Myanmar. Many projects will now come to an end and affect lives in countries such as Afghanistan, Syria, Somaliland, Nigeria and so many more. So by cutting the funding to these numerous projects, this government is going to cause many unnecessary deaths. This is a scandal and we need to highlight this callous approach taken today. And before members opposite say, oh, it's just Labour members whinging again, let's have a look at the people who are calling for a reversal of their cuts. Tory ministers such as Ruth Davidson, Baroness Sugg, who resigned from the government in November over these planned cuts, and Alok Sharma. There are other world leaders, my apologies. And there are other world leaders condemning the cuts, including Samantha Power, head of USAID. Malala, who calls on the Prime Minister, to keep his promise of helping 40 million girls go to school, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, who describes the Chancellor's decision as shameful and wrong. Interestingly, every Prime Minister still alive is also opposed to the plan. These are big hitters and their condemnation is very clear. So I would urge the current Prime Minister and the Chancellor to think again, go back to the drawing board and plan a different route, one that doesn't disadvantage millions of peoples in the countries less affluent than our own. So this isn't fair and it isn't right. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to be very clear. I will be voting against this government's plan to cut the overseas aid budget by £4 billion this year, and I would urge honourable members opposite to do the same, because the world is watching. Thank you.
David Warburton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very pleased that the House has this opportunity both to debate and to determine this question. I've always defended our aid budget, and I do not think that we should search for economies at the expense of the most vulnerable globally and at the expense of our own reputation and influence globally. I don't need to rehearse the case for ODA spending. It's vaccination of 55 million people, it's saving of an incredible 10 million children from hunger, it's help in providing 50 million people with the means to climb out of poverty. And I don't need to describe the soft power benefits. Its influence for Britain culturally, diplomatically, politically, its symbolic significance and its demonstration of leadership. I could not, therefore, support the reduction of the spending when its return to 0.7% was effectively at the whim or under the control of the government. No matter how strong the intent might be to raise it again, events are always likely to overtake and overcome good intentions. So I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, for the conversations that we've had in recent days. And given the uncertainty in the economy, I entirely understand his reluctance to offer a date for the restoration of the 0.7. But a set of conditions, it seemed to me, would provide a solution that would provide a pathway governed by objective circumstances, and ceding control of that mechanism to the OBR and basing it on conditions which were met as recently as 2018-19 and forecasted by the OBR in 2018, 19 and 20 to be met in the following financial year. These conditions do provide that pathway back to both our manifesto commitment and our duty to the poorest in the world. The Treasury is effectively outsourcing its spending decisions to the OBR and to the state of the public finances, something which I don't believe has happened before. And this, I think, does provide us with the certainty that we need to know that the cut is temporary and our commitment for 0.7% will be upheld, and it ensures that our public finances are protected. And this not only provides us with a route back, but ensures that the current position is transitory. So I will be supporting this motion because the worth of a commitment is whether or not it's upheld in the face of challenges, and this allows us to meet our challenges and meet our commitments.
We now go to Geraint Davis.
Madam Deputy Speaker, there's no economic or moral justification for cutting overseas aid from the richest to the poorest at this most desperate time in the eye of the pandemic storm that spreads death, disease, and hunger like a wildfire through developing nations. Imagine looking at your children starving in front of you, huddled in a tent in the blistering heat of Afghanistan, Yemen, or Syria. Or as you think about the cars and the houses and the fridges and Netflix of people in the West, or looking at your daughter who could help create a better world with an education who won't get one, or your parents who've just died from COVID. This poverty, this ignorance, this disease can be helped by us by reinstating the aid budget. And as host of the G7 and COP26, we should be taking moral leadership. Let's be clear. We can afford those to help those in greatest need more, not less, because the cost of UK borrowing is down, not up since the pandemic. Why? Because the global interest rates are down, so our borrowing costs are down from 37 billion in 2019-20 to 23 billion in 2021. That's a 14 billion pound saving in spending on debt interest for the UK, but aid spending is still being cut by 4.4 billion. And the Prime Minister's just said every pound we spend in aid has to be borrowed. But we can afford more aid now because our borrowing costs, our costs on savings on debt interest are massively down. Now is the time to invest, to build back better in the developing world out of the pandemic, to invest in climate change adaptation with new green industries that will help all our environments. Now in a low interest world is the time to borrow and invest. $1 million cut in aid could instead be reinstated and service a debt of £100 million investment. But only the G7 can borrow at such low interest rates. Developing nations cannot. And so it's no use saying we can't afford it this year due to the pandemic. So maybe we'll reinstate money in future years. We can afford it this year. And now is when it's needed most. If savings were needed, and they're not, they should be made after the pandemic when the poorest are back on their feet, not in their darkest hour of need. And we know the politics of popular nationalism. We know 7.6 million people in the UK are now in hunger. So of course people are saying charity begins at home, but that hunger is unnecessary too. And we shouldn't give other G7 nations the excuse to cut their aid. We need more aid, not less. Britain is better than this. Let's make the world better. Let's reinstate our aid budget now.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm glad to see the Chancellor in his place. I've got a couple of specific questions for him on science policy. But in the context of the debates in which we're taking place in today, I'm very proud of our leadership and our contribution to supporting people right across the world, and I voted enthusiastically for the Act of Parliament that brought in the 0.7 commitment into law, and pay tribute to my right honourable friend for his work in that. But he will know that in so doing, the Act of Parliament specifically anticipated circumstances in which temporarily the 0.7% target may not be made, including, and I quote from the Act, any substantial change in gross national income, and fiscal circumstances, in particular, the likely impact of the target on taxation and public spending and public borrowing. It's hard, Madam Deputy Speaker, not to consider that the circumstances that we are experiencing fall plumb into line with what the framers of the legislation and those who supported it had in mind. Of course, I'll give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm most grateful to my right honourable friend. I was involved in the drafting of the Act, and I do not believe that that is what we intended with those clauses. But let me also say this to him. Has he noticed that the Governor of the Bank of England has said that the economy will have been restored to pre-COVID levels, I think, next month? Doesn't he think that's a very significant indicator of why we shouldn't be doing what the government would like us to do today?
Well, I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend, and I quite agree that that is an encouraging assessment, not least for the prospects of our returning to the 0.7%. I studied very carefully the Hansard transcripts of the debate, and indeed some of the criticism was that the criteria might be might be insufficiently precise. And so I do think that the innovation of establishing in advance and giving to the OBR the trigger for the return is a sensible course. And indeed they mirror more or less the fiscal rules that were once called the fiscal mandate that were in place at the time that the Act of Parliament was originally adopted. So I want it back, and I hope as the Governor does that will be sooner rather than later, and that the Chancellor will be able to confirm that is his firm intentions. I think is clear from what he said in the written statement. But my questions on science are twofold. The science budget is very importantly increasing from around 9 billion a year in 2017 to 22 billion a year from 2024-5. And that includes, as it always has done, ODA, includes overseas development assistance. Will the Chancellor specifically reiterate the commitment to achieving that £22 billion by 2024-25? And secondly, will he reassure me that a report that I read, that the 0.5% limit on ODA could somehow prevent us engaging in international scientific research projects that we were perfectly willing to fund because they are excellent and are justified as part of that budget that is rising to £22 billion. Because we all know that science is inherently international. The best science is global, and the best teams are often international teams. And it will be a concern, a grave concern, if that 0.5% target would in any way be a cap on international collaboration. Knowing my right honourable friend the Chancellor's commitment to science and technology, I can't believe that is his intention. So his commitment to the 22 billion budget and his reassurance that this will not be a cap will be very important in establishing that the science aspects can continue, and that is in effect the removal of a ring fence rather than the limitation of international scientific research.
Speaker, the Prime Minister told the House earlier that there was common ground in the House. I think he's right, but I suspect he's not standing on that common ground, listening to contributions from across the way. And I pay tribute to the Right Honourable Gentleman from Sutton Coldfield for the courage that he and other fellow Honourable and Right Honourable members on the other side have shown in standing up for this issue consistently, but also, I have to say, standing up for their manifesto along with the rest of us. And the government has a good story to tell on this issue, if it wanted to, on Gavi, for example, on their support for education for women and girls. And I do wonder why they don't want to tell this story to the country. I think because too many of them are ashamed of it, and because, as the Right Honourable Gentleman from Sutton Coldfield said before, they're playing to a gallery, but they're playing to the wrong gallery, and it is a dangerous game that they are playing. The proposals before the House today, they are myopic and they are mean-minded. Mean-minded because we see that this is a trick, it's a fiscal trap. We were promised a straight up and down vote, we weren't given one, instead we were given this little twisting mechanism. Mean-minded too because, as we've heard, it will cost lives to make this cut, and because it is already a smaller cut to what would have been a smaller cake anyway. The amount of money had already gone down. To cut it further is simply mean. And you can't, with any of these programmes, you can't simply turn the taps on, turn the taps off, and turn the taps back on again. The damage that will be done to British overseas aid programmes will carry on much longer after we restore the 0.7%, if under this proposed mechanism we ever did restore it. It'll set programmes back, it'll set research and development back, including, incidentally, for my constituents. I have a constituent who works in water purification, I have a constituent who works in energy, localised energy matters. These cuts will have an effect overseas. Let's be clear, they'll have cut effects in this country as well, in terms of innovation and our ability to take technologies across the world. It will have effects in areas such as the polio eradication programme, where, as my right honourable friend from Leeds has said, we've got to cuts of 95% will put that programme back. And it's myopic for the reasons that have already been said by my right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, honourable gentleman from Tonbridge and Melling, because it will damage British soft power. The British Council tell me that they will lose 15 to 20% of staff and unable to carry out the programmes in the countries abroad where we need to be influencing. And also because it will affect our strategic position, as Leader of the Opposition has said. And let's put it in this, I think that overseas aid is a moral issue. But if we can't look at it like that, let's be clear. Our enemies and our adversaries, our Russia and China for our adversaries, our enemies IQ and IS, will fill the gap if we don't. And it will simply make matters worse in the long run. This is a short-sighted, short-termist cut. It's mean-minded. And I pay tribute to the right honourable gentleman for his leadership, but I have to tell you, I won't be accepting it tonight.
We now go to Saki Bharti.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to start by acknowledging the excellent speeches by a number of honourable members who've so passionately set out the case for overseas development assistance. In particular, my right honourable friend, the member for Sutton Coldfield, very eloquently and characteristically passionately has made the case for the ODA budget. And in normal times, I would be with him in this debate. However, today I support the government's decision. And I'm a big believer in the role of international aid and how it shows the world what we stand for as a nation. Through our role on the global stage is amplified by our magnanimity through international aid. And in a world with ever-increasing threats, our overseas development assistance budget represents a tool through which the United Kingdom can demonstrate its generosity, its moral strength, its friendship, and its nobility. When considering this, one can understand why it evokes so much passion from all sides of the House. Indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, many of my constituents have spoken to me about the importance they place on the ODA budget. But time and time again, they have said to me, we know it's been a difficult time. We know we must manage the economy. We know we must pay the bills. And as my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, has already laid out, we cannot ignore the state our economy is in after the worst crisis since the last two world wars. To have borrowed over £300 billion, the equivalent of 14.3% of our GDP, well, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's clear that difficult decisions have to be made. And in this context, I do understand why the government has had to make this temporary cut. But in my view, it must be temporary. And with the clarity offered by the Treasury, I believe it will be. Of course, we must repair our economy. This is not a controversial thing. It is simply what is expected of us by the British people. We also continue to spend almost £10 billion as part of the overseas development assistance budget if this cut is to go through. But the British people also expect strong public services and efficiency from government. And so difficult decisions are inevitable and they obviously have to be made. And we also continue to demonstrate our soft power through other means. The distribution of the vaccine is an excellent example of this. Due to the government's investment, there were 500 million doses available to 168 countries, all distributed at no profit. By the end of the year, we will have distributed 3 billion doses. British ingenuity and British generosity. Finally, in a world of finite resources and increasing strains on our economy, we must make sure that our ODA budget is being deployed effectively and projects should be subject to the highest levels of scrutiny. In other words, it should not just be important how much we spend, but how we spend that money. Outcomes matter. The effectiveness of the budget should not be measured purely in monetary terms, but against robust targets, which are set to achieve our objectives and ultimately make the world a better place.
22 has withdrawn, so we go to Alicia Cairns.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm enormously proud of our record on supporting the most vulnerable and using aid to make our people and those around the world safer. But we have suffered the biggest recession in 300 years, and that's not a situation that we could have predicted when I fought the election on our manifesto promises. And yet the International Development Act 2015 explicitly anticipated this sort of crisis where a departure from targets is necessary. Now, if you'd asked me during the election whether I would have reconsidered this commitment to 0.7%, I would have said yes, but only in the very darkest of times. And if the last year or so has not been the darkest of times, then what is? Since my election, we've had to make an enormously large amount of difficult choices. And those difficult choices and dark times, in Rutland and Melton, they look like the government having to support 17,900 jobs through furlough, 4,500 individuals, underwrite nearly £123 million in loans. That's almost half of all jobs, employee jobs in Rutland and Melton that we had to save. and that support was necessary, but the costs pose real risks for the future too. Now, even with the reduction in UK aid, we remain the second largest donor in the G7. The taxes of residents of Rutland and Melton will continue to go towards saving lives, disaster relief, peacekeeping and climate. And we should be proud of that. And I hope the reorganisation of the FCDO can augment our capacity to respond to crises outside of the ODA budget through the new conflict centre. But today in the Chamber, honourable members have criticised the government, arguing that other G7 countries are not temporarily reducing their ODA budget. But in 2020, we were one of only 2 G7 countries to meet that target, and the only one to do it since 2013 every year. Perhaps it's because those countries have not met their commitments in normal times, but they do not now need to make a temporary reduction. Indeed, they had no plans in the first place to meet the 0.7% they promised. With this temporary reduction, we will still exceed the funding provided by every country, bar one. We will remain one of the most generous countries in the world. This is a temporary measure. It is one that recognises the fiscal duty we have to our children. It recognises that we will still stand by those most in need. And the government has defined the fiscal circumstances under which we will return to 0.7%. This does not diminish us as a country. And whilst this is a difficult decision, it is the right one for now because we have faced the darkest of times. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The SNP opposes these cuts, as my good friend from Dundee West eloquently outlined. We are committed to our 0.7% manifesto commitment. 98.2% of the votes cast in the Stirling election in 2019 went to parties committed to the 0.7%. I am representing my party and my constituency in taking the stance that we have. Now, we would pay tribute and warmly praise a number of the members on the government benches. We've really seen some refreshing blasts of integrity throughout this discussion, and this is too important for Punch and Judy politics. Now, there's 3 points I'd make because this has been a well-trodden path by this point in the debate. Firstly, 0.7% for the government is a manifesto commitment that was made barely 18 months ago. Yes, point 2, COVID has changed everything. It has, of course. It's changed everything for everybody else as well. And to use COVID as a pretext for this cut when the developing world is also dealing with COVID and the effects of the economic impact is reprehensible to my mind. The cut is, thirdly, out of step with the rest of the world. The UK is the outlier in this. Other countries are increasing their aid spending, not decreasing it. Now, the UK remains, as we've heard, a significant donor of international aid. I applaud that, I welcome that, I acknowledge that. But this is a broken promise to the poorest people in the world at the worst possible time. And as I say, it flies in the face of the global consensus. Canada is increasing their spend by 28%, where the UK is decreasing it by 25%. France increasing theirs by 36%, Italy by 13%, the US by 39.4%, Germany by 6%. It is the UK that is out of step. Now, Global Britain is clearly not the SNP's project, but we are engaged in this because we don't want to see the poorest in the world let down, and we want to try and rectify a mistake to see Scottish taxes, or more realistically Scottish debt, go to effective purposes rather than where this government might take it. We are entirely unconvinced by the government's compromise proposal. We think to present this as an arithmetic formula is to misrepresent this issue entirely. It's been acknowledged throughout this debate, and estimates, of course, on numbers can be arguable, but only once in the last 20 years have the criteria foreseen within the government's mechanism been met. We fear this is a formula to entrench the cuts, not to bring them back. Now, the books do need to be balanced, of course they do, and I feel for the government in that task. But the difference we're talking about between 0.5 and 0.7 is barely 1% of the global sum. So for the government that has spent money on increasing defence spend, increasing nuclear capacity, blowing £1.3 billion on a needless stamp duty freeze, and yet worse, is talking about a royal yacht, I think the priorities are wrong, and I do hope a significant number of the members opposite will join the coalition to put this right. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the member for Stirling. I've been speaking to my constituents in Derbyshire Dales about this. They are, by and large, a very generous and kindly-spirited people. I've listened carefully to their views today. Following those discussions, I will be voting for today's motion, as it will provide certainty and a path for international spending clearly outlining that path back to our 0.7 Manifesto commitment, while delivering responsible public finances and allowing us to maintain our high level of spending on other priorities at home, such as the NHS, schools and the police. It is also delivering our Manifesto promises for responsible public finances. At 0.5%, the UK is spending over £10 billion in overseas aid this year. This is a phenomenal amount of money. We are one of the most generous and kindest and biggest spenders in the world. Let's not forget that. And I would like to remind those who wish to unfairly characterise this Conservative government as somehow being mean or uncaring on overseas aid, that Conservative governments have consistently spent more on international aid than Labour. Between 1997 and 2009, under Labour governments, the average spend on overseas aid was just 0.36%. So the opposition are hardly in a position to lecture this government on overseas spending. The leader of the opposition may find it helpful in court, but those arguments don't work here. Once again, the opposition is totally out of tune with the British population. We believe, on balance, we have to balance the spending of this unusual time that the government's had with the COVID pandemic spending. The government has spent over £400 billion on keeping this nation safe, keeping our families secure, preserving jobs and livelihoods. This has given the people of my constituency in Derbyshire Dales a way forward in very frightening and worrying times. On behalf of the people of Derbyshire Dales, I do thank the government for this support, and it is kind and it is not mean. We must not forget that every pound we spend in international aid is borrowed. My adult sons remind me of this regularly. This money is borrowed from our future generations. As a mother of 4 adult children and representing many, many families in Derbyshire Dales, I feel I have a duty to restore and help restore the public finances to some sort of responsible level. It's for these reasons I have no hesitation in supporting this sound motion today.
Here. We now go to Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We've had a 20-year cross-party consensus on aid that we should meet the 0.7% of GNI, the UN target. I very much regret that consensus has been lost. Of course, when GDP goes down, our aid budget will go down. But the pandemic is no justification for reducing the proportion of national income committed to international aid. In a fine speech, the Right Honourable Member for Sutton Coldfield referred to the strength of Christian aid in Chesham and Amersham. As a Treasury Minister in the late 90s, I saw the churches play the key role in securing that cross-party consensus. They were the instigators of Jubilee 2000, ahead of the millennium, and the key supporters of Make Poverty History afterwards. And those campaigns led on to the historic 2005 Gleneagles deal, writing off $40 billion worth of debts owed by 18 highly indebted poor countries. The idea of cancelling unpayable debts inspired people and drew people together. Rooted in teaching in the Bible, it had a dramatic impact on government policy and on the lives of millions. Last month, I joined a number of MPs on a virtual trip to Togo, organised by the Christian charity Compassion UK. We visited their UK aid-funded child survival project. The situation in Togo is desperate. Under 5 mortality is among the worst in the world. 1 in 25 babies don't reach the age of 1. Women have a 1 in 58 chance of dying in pregnancy or childbirth. Compassion's work, supported by UK aid, is starting to change things. In the first year, the project reached over 4,000 people in extreme poverty. The number of full-term healthy babies delivered was 24% above target. UK development aid helps save lives amongst the world's poorest people. We met somebody called Amma. She registered in the programme when she was 7 months pregnant. She was struggling to feed her existing children. When she reached full term, her husband left suddenly. She also had malaria. Her baby and her own life were at risk. The Child Survival Project provided food and hygiene support. Her expenses were paid. She gave birth to a son, and she's since been able to set up a business of her own. Even a small amount of aid saves lives. The cuts to UK aid put thousands of projects like those run by Compassion UK in Togo at risk. I really hope Parliament will reject this motion.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful to be called in this debate this afternoon. I recognise that the Chancellor of the Exchequer has probably the most difficult job of anybody in the government, perhaps in the whole country, bar none. He's the only person employed to say no and make difficult choices about all of the different spending demands that all of us present at the door of the Treasury. But nevertheless, Madam Deputy Speaker, I do share the concerns and the fears of those colleagues who this afternoon have expressed doubt and concern that the cuts that we are debating will become permanent. And that I also share the fear that 0.5% spending becomes the default setting for our overseas aid spending, and the cuts become locked in. They become permanent, a permanent withdrawal, a permanent stepping back of the level of commitment that Britain has given overseas amongst the poorest countries on earth. And the reason that I share these fears is for some of the reasons that have already been outlined this afternoon, but also, Madam Deputy Speaker, because I think we're in danger of overlooking just how enormous was the effort that got us to the point where we as a House, as the House of Commons, were united on making that commitment to 0.7. And the member for East Ham has just reminded us of it then. I was perhaps one of the few members here this afternoon who was in the House in 2005, and I recall the enormous lobbying efforts that were being made, not just by the churches, but by trade unions, women's institutes, groups in all of our constituencies. There was demand for this. And it required opposition frontbenchers to work with government frontbenchers. It required opposition backbenchers to work with government backbenchers. And for me, it represented a really high watermark of what can be achieved from this House of Commons when people choose to bury some of their political differences and work together for a cause that's much bigger than our most immediate political needs.
Thank my right honourable very much for giving way. He's making a wonderful speech. Does he remember, he referred to his longevity in the House, does he remember with me Make Poverty History and the way it galvanised national opinion? And does he accept that Beat the Crises, Crack the Crises, which is the current successor to that generation, reinforced by younger people, once COVID is over and they are able to show what they feel, they will make very clear their opposition to this foolish decision that the government has made?
My right honourable friend makes a very strong point. And he's right, there was this popular movement behind it. But nevertheless, Madam Deputy Speaker, it wasn't universally popular. There were staunch critics inside this House, critics outside the House, sections of the press absolutely hated it. And as we went through the financial crisis of 2009-2010, the criticisms became louder, and as the ripples from that crisis have kind of moved through our politics over the last 11 years, it's become increasingly difficult to keep making that case for investing 0.7% of our GNI in helping the world's poorest people. But I'm proud of the fact, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we chose to stick to that. Even when we were making very difficult decisions and choices about other aspects of public spending, we took a decision that actually spending more on the people with the very least globally was the right thing to do. And it was the right thing to do then in the wake of the last financial crisis, and I believe it's still the right thing to do now as we're going through this awful pandemic. And yes, we face a moment in our politics where we have enormous pressures on our public finances, and I made those remarks about the Chancellor of the Exchequer very sincerely at the start. But what is a difficult moment for us fiscally and politically, it's an absolutely tragic, devastating moment for the poorest people around the world, for whom the pandemic has been the cause of another wave of dire poverty and suffering. And that's what we're really debating here this afternoon. These are not difficult issues, and there have been sincere speeches being made on either side of the argument. And I'm very sad, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I won't be able to support my government this afternoon. But as I said, I think that 0.7% commitment we made
all those years ago was the right thing to do, and I pay tribute to my right honourable friend, the member for Sutton Coldfield, for the role that he played. But sticking to it now is still the right thing to do.
Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister brought a very sombre tone to the dispatch box this afternoon, trying to convince us that this decision was all a regrettable consequence of the economic output of the pandemic. But that rings hollow when we remember the glee with which he stood at the dispatch box this time last year and announced the abolition of DFID, when he described aid and DFID as a giant cash point in the sky. When, as Foreign Secretary, we remember that he quoted Kipling in a Buddhist temple in Myanmar, or when he was a journalist and he used the language of Pekingese and watermelon smiles. This is a Prime Minister and a government who know little and care less about the struggles of poverty, whether at home or abroad, and the life-saving, life-changing difference that aid can and does make around the world. A bit like the evil standing orders that we're debating later today, the aid budget to them is just another part of David Cameron's legacy that they seem so keen to bury. I think the Prime Minister likes the fact that he's the only living Prime Minister that supports the cut in the aid budget. It's part of this year zero hard rain approach to the UK consensus that has existed for so long. A consensus that saw every single member, as we've said, of this House elected to the commitment of 0.7%. A consensus that has existed for 20 years, a target that has been met consistently since 2013. 0.5% is completely arbitrary. 0.7% was calculated by international organisations when it was set in the 1970s. 0.5% is completely arbitrary. We've not heard why it's not 0.4% or 0.6% or 0.3%. It's simply, it sounds good. It sounds like the government is taking decisive action, and that seems to be their attitude to so many aspects of government just now. Never mind the impact or the feasibility. Yes.
I'm grateful to him, and he's making some very serious points, but does he accept that in fact it's the UK who set out 0.7% in law? Many countries around the world also commit to 0.7%, but always fall short and don't bother to have a discussion about it.
But the UK is now resigning from that. The government is resigning. It won't even give us a legally binding vote on the decision to resign from that commitment that was agreed by the entire House. And what we consistently hear from the dispatch box is soft power, superpower is about global leadership. And in a year when the UK should be taking leadership, it's taking a step backwards. And of course, the decision to cut aid is being shown to be doubly problematic because aid was due to fall anyway. GNI was falling as a result of pandemic-related economic contraction anyway, and there would have been tough decisions and funding squeezes, but these would have been predictable and manageable. And this notion that it's all being paid for by debt, well, you could say that about all kinds of aspects of government savings. All governments around the world run debts and deficits, and they invest for the future. And aid is an investment in all of our collective futures. But what is happening now in real time is that drastic sweeping cuts have already been made to get down to this completely arbitrary target of 0.5%, and these will be massively difficult to undo. And despite today's attempt to bounce the House into a decision, the government's own rhetoric and all these other shenanigans, the government's own rhetoric doesn't add up. The Prime Minister repeatedly says that the COVID investment it's making is going to be additional. Well, if it's going to be additional, then how can the government spend 0.5%? It must be spending more than 0.5%. And if it's not additional, then what else is going to be cut? It doesn't make any sense. And I didn't get an answer in the last debate either about the concerns raised about UK aid match. The public have been donating in good faith £1 to certain charities on the basis that the UK government would match that, and those charities have now been told, such as Mary's Meals, have now been told this funding would be delayed and they'll be wondering whether it will ever appear at all. Hundreds of constituents in Glasgow North have contacted me about this since the cut was first announced, and that speaks to thousands of activists and organisations across the country. Aid works best when it is stable and predictable in the long term. There will be no undoing some of the damage caused by the UK government's cuts that have been hastily and in some cases disastrously implemented. A return to 0.7% ASAP will at least mitigate some of that damage, and I hope some of the Tories who have been opposed to the government's decision so far will continue to show resilience so that they vote tonight to restore our aid commitment to our poorest brothers and sisters around the world.
Ruth Edwards.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I didn't come into this House to reduce overseas aid. But then I also didn't come here to tell people that they can't see their parents or their grandchildren, that they had to close the business they've spent years building up, or that they couldn't get married with their friends and family there to support them. These are just some of the soul-searching choices that COVID has forced on all of us in the last 18 months. And today's choice is no different. Voting for the government's motion will take £5 billion out of the overseas aid budget. Voting against it will cut £5 billion out of our public services here in the UK, or necessitate tax rises on our constituents, many of whom have been living on restrained incomes over the pandemic. It's important that we're honest with our constituents, especially at a time when the NHS has got a huge task to get a backlog of millions of operations and treatments down, when so many children have had their education so badly disrupted, and when the police are dealing with a chilling rise in crimes like domestic violence. Now, there have been some suggestions in this debate here today. My right honourable friend, the member for Halton Price and Howden, has suggested cutting HS2. No doubt very popular in some places, but something that many of my business leaders throughout the East Midlands has made clear will significantly degrade the ability to grow the economy there. The right honourable gentleman, the member for Dundee West, has suggested degrading our cyber capabilities at a time when our public services, when our businesses, when our society is increasingly reliant on digital infrastructure and digital services. So there are no easy choices here. There are no cost-free options. The second point I want to make, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that the definition of ODA is very narrow. It excludes much of the support the UK provides overseas from being included in it. £85 million invested to help develop the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, which is now being distributed without profit across the world. We are the largest donor to Gavi, immunising 300 million children against infectious diseases, and we provide £350 million a year to the UN's peacekeeping budget on top of our ODA contributions. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, even with the reduction to 0.5%, the UK will spend more as a percentage of GNI than almost any other major economy, more than the US, Canada, Japan, and well above the OECD average. We will still be the third largest bilateral humanitarian donor in the world. So to talk about Britain as if it's withdrawing from the world or turning its back on people is, in my view, divorced from reality.
Fiscal.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I, first of all, like others, would wish to pay tribute to individuals on the government benches who have brought us here because of their tenacity, who have shown the courage of their convictions that the government claimed to hold, but despite the obfuscation of the Prime Minister, are seeking to renege on, which is why I think this debate, as I say, is so welcome. It is an opportunity to rehearse the arguments that we've had before and others have said today. They remain. The principles still remain and the arguments still apply. It still is a situation that it is in our own economic self-interest to ensure that we remain committed to point 7. It is environmentally necessary, especially with the spectre of COP26 arising. It is also the case that international aid is a right, not a charity given by us. It's something that we need to repay for historical acts. But there are two primary arguments, two twin imperatives that I think apply, and they're the arguments I wish to make. First of all, there's a moral imperative that this is for humanity. We are all part of the human race and we require to look after our sisters and brothers wherever they are, whatever nationality or passport they hold, even whatever colour that passport may be. Equally, it's a necessity of public health, which is in fact the corollary of that, because it's in our own self-interest that we carry out these actions. Dealing first of all with the moral argument, it's been made quite clear by many others, quite eloquently, that this will be catastrophic. And it's not enough for the Prime Minister to say that this is a once-in-a-century event. It will be repeated, as we have seen with variants, and indeed we will face other health challenges if the Third World continues to face the problems that it does. That is why we have to address it. They are unable to deal as we are, despite the challenges that we're already facing. We've seen what happened in Africa with AIDS. The consequences for Africa of coronavirus are horrendous. It's therefore a moral imperative that we take actions to ensure that we protect them as well as protecting us, because that takes us on to the public health argument. Because if we do not address this issue there, then it will come here. We've already mentioned, as I said earlier in the speech, we've had Delta variants, we'll have other variants, we'll have even other variants that won't be capable of protecting us by the vaccinations that we've had. If it isn't the coronavirus outbreak, it will be some other form of ill health that will challenge humanity. And therefore we have to ensure that we take every step possible to ensure that not only do we protect ourselves, but we protect everybody. Because by protecting everybody, we do protect ourselves. People will march, people will come, people will ill, and people will be infected. If the border force can't keep out drugs, they won't be able to keep out individuals and an illness. It's therefore in our own interest to ensure that we carry out that moral imperative which is quite right for the benefit of society, for all of us, and equally for our own individual benefit in our own land, and indeed individually, we protect the public health of this country.
Peter Bone.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a great pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for East Lothian, who speaks with passion. I don't accept his arguments, but I do accept that those people that will vote against the government tonight do so in genuine concern. And I also welcome the fact that we've got a lot of SNP members here, we've got the DUP here, we've got Liberal Democrats. But only 2 Labour backbenchers are bothered to stay in the debate, and only one has just arrived. So I'm not so sure about the concerns expressed from the Labour benches. But I do welcome one thing that the honourable gentleman said, is the fact that this Parliament is having a vote and a debate on this issue. And that is to the great credit of the government. And they are bringing forward a motion that they may well lose tonight. And that's to their credit, to let this Parliament decide on this very important issue. And I do think this debate isn't particularly about the merits of overseas aid on point 7. It's about the state the economy is in. Now, I can't tell from sitting here, Madam Deputy Speaker, whether the Chancellor is his happy self, but he's very popular at the moment because he's been giving money away and helping people. But there is an economic crisis coming down the line. And certainly on these benches, we should recognise that, which is the reason we should support the cut of £4 billion in overseas aid. Because if we don't do that, the Chancellor either has to borrow £4 billion more, or he has to tax more, or he has to cut public expenditure. So that's actually what the issue is about, and that's why I will be supporting the government tonight. But can I just touch on what I think is more important with overseas aid is outcome, not the amount of money we're spending. And this was something the Labour government used to say, we're spending record amounts of money. It didn't mean they were having record outcomes. And when I was chairman of the all-party group against human trafficking, it was often the small charities without state money that were doing the best outcomes. And the great thing about this government, Madam Deputy Speaker, is what they've done with the vaccine and AstraZeneca. The fact that we've given this to the world, and there'll be 3 billion doses across the world by the end of next year, is a tremendous testament to what this government has done. It's world-leading, and it's changing the world, and it's saving millions of people from being seriously ill and dying. That's the sort of thing we should be proud about. We shouldn't be worried about a figure.
Lawrence Eshalomi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And many honourable and right honourable members have already spoken about the different areas that will be impacted by our proposed cut to international aid budget. And I want to focus my remarks on a subject which is really important. Last month marked 40 years since the first reported AIDS case and the subsequent discovery of HIV. And although we've made big progress in fighting HIV in the UK and across the world, AIDS remains a leading cause of death for women of reproductive age. And although preventable, over 1.5 million people acquired HIV last year, and 690,000 people lost their lives to an AIDS-related illness. The HIV epidemic continues to devastate communities right across the world. And yet screening has fallen by 40% in Africa and Asia over the past year. Ending new HIV transmissions in the UK is a global effort. And yet shamefully, our funding to the UN AIDS project has been dropped by a staggering 83%. And as we only know too well, pandemics can only be beaten together. Up to now, the UK has been instrumental in reducing the stigma of this really terrible disease and helping to save the lives of millions of people. And I want to pay tribute to the Terence Higgins Trust for their new campaign launched today called Life Really Changed, celebrating people who live with HIV. I represent Vauxhall, a constituency with a large migrant population and one of the highest rates of HIV prevalence in the country. Now more than ever, it is so important, if we are truly committed to global Britain, to step up in our responsibilities, not step back. The UK should be taking a leading global step to help reverse the devastating spread of HIV and AIDS. Otherwise, how are we supposed to meet our target of zero transmissions by 2030? I hope members will reflect on that. And it's not just about the issues that happen in our country here, but right across the world. And I hope that they will be joining me in voting against this motion. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Tim Loden.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome the fact the Government have brought this motion here today, but I'm afraid I'm going to vote against it and to restore the 0.7% commitment. I'm worried that the new criteria would only have been met in one of the last 7 years, and goodness knows when it will be met again, and effectively we're locking in 0.5% for the foreseeable future. I acknowledge absolutely the huge generosity of the UK taxpayer and the contribution by COVAX and others. But we cannot stop now. I voted for, I campaigned for, I was really proud that a Conservative-led government brought in, enshrined in law, that 0.7% commitment. I stood on a manifesto to keep it in 2015, 2017 and 2019, proudly doing so. Our manifesto in 2019 said, we are proud of our peace-building and humanitarian efforts around the world, particularly in war-torn and divided societies, and of our record in helping to reduce global poverty. And we pledge to proudly maintain our commitment to spend 0.7% of GNI on development. No riders that it was dependent on the state of finances, whether debt's going up or down, or how much the Treasury is bringing in revenue. No small print, no ifs, no buts. And I believe in standing by manifesto pledges. And it would have been even more unsatisfactory if we'd not at least had this vote here today. Everyone's talked about difficult decisions. It was specifically to avoid short-term difficult decisions that we enshrined that commitment in law and crafted a careful formula so the money went up in good times and went down in bad times, as is happening. But this will be a double whammy, as everyone has said. It's going to go down because the economy has contracted, and it's going to go down further because the formula is being reduced as well. And of course, COVID has impacted severely on many countries whose health systems are far less resilient than ours in dealing with the pandemic. And as we know, global pandemics need globally coordinated action, as well as all facing the challenges of the new strains mutating in far-flung corners of the world. And the UK plays a key part in that and must continue playing a key part in that, not just with vaccines. But this is also a false economy. Abruptly pulling projects part-way through makes no financial sense and increases uncertainty. Pulling the malaria programme funding in Nigeria, which is supposed to go on to 2024, cutting 48 million from the NHS Overseas Training Scheme when people are being trained in important posts in developing countries, the 80 million cut to water sanitation in the middle of a pandemic, and the circumstances in Yemen that I mentioned earlier. Global Britain is about projecting not just military and diplomatic influence, not just about pursuing new trading and investment partnerships beyond this continent, but complementary to this is the exercise of soft power. Hugely important, and it's proved highly influential and effective for UK PLC, and our world-leading commitment to 0.7% enshrined in law is an important, and I have to say, very cost-effective part of that. Climate change is a major focus of it. We're chairing COP, for goodness sake. What message does that send to the rest of the world? This is a false economy at the wrong time.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, for calling me to speak in this very important debate, and I draw the attention of members to my register of interests. The choice we face here today is clear. Are we global Britain or little Britain? This is a trap for the unwary and, in fact, goes further than that. This is a deliberate cut of aid, which the party opposite has been wanting to do for a long time, and I share the concern of many parties, members opposite, in not wanting to be seen as the nasty party. We're the only G7 country to be cutting our aid, so it simply doesn't have to be done. We don't have to shrug our shoulders and say, we're in the middle of the pandemic, this is another cost of COVID, we just have to get on and do this. No, this is a deliberate choice about what we do to retain our promises to the world's poorest people at the time when we're all suffering around the world together. It's not only how much we're cutting as well, but how these cuts are being made. Not very strategically, very fast for many of the smallest projects which have the best outcomes, and without any impact assessment being done. Exactly. 0.7 is not some arbitrary figure dreamt up by a Treasury civil servant. One of the most memorable days of my life was standing on a stage in Edinburgh introducing Eddie Izzard to a massive crowd of people. Why would I bring this up now? Because it was a Make Poverty History rally. People had come in coaches from across the whole country. They'd got up the night before and they'd travelled overnight. They'd come from communities all over the country. They were of all ages, all backgrounds, with one mission: that we wanted to make poverty history, and we wanted to see the 0.7% prescribed in law. And it was many years after that, so it's been many, many years of campaigning that brought the 0.7% into reality, and it's not something that we can lose so easily, because I share the concerns of many members that if we lose this today, it will be many, many years until we see the return, if ever, of that 0.7%, which the British public, Madam Deputy Speaker, do want to see. Exactly. People from across my constituency have written to me about the aid cuts, saying they do not agree with these cuts. It's a small amount in the whole scale of government spending, just 1% of our borrowing. And it's very good value for money. So it's false economy, and it's wrong to cut the South Sudanese peace project, which has been built up over many years, based in trust, and will result in a devastating results in South Sudan. It's been called a crushing blow to the people of South Sudan. So today is an opportunity to restore the cross-party agreement on aid, restore our ambition and our influential place in the world, to do the right thing and to vote against these cuts.
We now go to Catherine West. We don't seem to have any voice for Catherine West, so I'm going to go to Tobias Elwood and come back to Catherine West. Tobias Elwood.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. This is a vote about our soft power, a vote on the definition of global Britain, a test of our political courage to see the bigger international picture and stay committed to our international obligations even when we face difficulties at home. I will not tire of telling this House just how dangerous and complex our world is becoming. A simple question I put to the Prime Minister, the National Security Advisor, the Defence Secretary and all the respective heads of the armed forces: is global instability over the next 5 to 10 years going to increase or decrease? And in every single case, the answer was increase. We face a very unpredictable, uncertain decade, with growing authoritarianism, extremism on the rise, an ever-assertive China and Russia, and of course climate change increasingly wreaking havoc across the world. The government acknowledges this in its own integrated review, but hard and soft power are two sides of the same coin, as we learnt to our peril in Afghanistan. And to cut our soft power will have operational, strategic and reputational consequences. The sheer scale of global challenges was acknowledged at the G7 summit. Yet here we are debating the reduction in our soft power profile, the only G7 nation to do so. In contrast, China is using its aid programs as a part of a long-term strategy to advance its own global reach. Look at what's happening across Africa and Asia. There is a new global soft power war taking place. This, to me, is the face of a Cold War that is slowly emerging, but we in the West have yet to wake up to its reality. China is weaponizing its immense soft power to significantly advance its influence and reach and to promote its own interpretation of the international rules-based order. And it ensnares dozens and dozens of countries into its sphere of influence. This is why we should not be diminishing our own soft power. I suspect the government may succeed today in winning the argument, but it will lose the moral high ground. We claim to be a problem-solving and burden-sharing nation with a global perspective. It is simply not a good look to promote a global Britain agenda emphasising leadership, responsibility and resolve, but then cut our overseas aid budget. I urge the government to ask what Churchill might say to the House now, given the 1930s feel to the world. Why not articulate to the nation the wider geopolitical uncertainty that we face, the urgency for the West to regroup, and the influential role that Britain could play if we retain our soft power commitments so we can begin to address the progressively dangerous trajectory our world is now on. I have no doubt if the government did this, the nation would be fully in support.
O'Hara.
Deputy Speaker, may I begin by saying how pleased I am that the Government has finally bowed to pressure and we in this House are having the vote that we were promised in cutting money to the world's poorest people. And it's absolutely right that we have that vote, because every member of this House must declare his or her position. I fear that without a meaningful vote, the members opposite could continue to hide behind crocodile tears or meaningless words of regret without ever having to display the courage of their conviction and stand up and tell this government that the decision to take £5 billion away from the world's poorest people is fundamentally wrong and morally repugnant. So at the end of this debate, we will all have to declare where we stand, and no one can continue in the hope that by choosing to stay silent, that he or she will not be asked to come off the fence. And although this vote has been a long time coming, it does mean that we are all in this House well rehearsed of the arguments. And absolutely no one can pretend that he or she does not know what they are voting for this evening, or they do not understand the consequences of their actions when they vote. And they now know that if they do support this motion, that money is not coming back. Madam Deputy Speaker, I find it utterly incomprehensible that the government of one of the richest countries in the world appears hell-bent on making the poorest people on this planet even poorer and more susceptible and vulnerable to disease, hunger and a lack of clean water. And for them to push this as vigorously as they have done, despite every single analysis telling them and us that millions of people will die, simply beggars belief. And it is shameful that if this motion is agreed tonight, it will mark a new low point for a country that pretends or boasts about being a beacon for tolerance, decency and humanity. This is the test of that vote. As I've said before, this country has a moral obligation to help those and now what we call the developing world, not least because this country is in no small way responsible for the situation that they now find themselves in. The UK, Great Britain, grew rich, powerful on the backs of the world's poor. We invaded, conquered, divided and plundered, leaving behind an impoverished wasteland. And it's about time this country woke up to its moral responsibility to assist those we abandoned to live with the consequences of British imperialism, and we should not be running away from that responsibility. And those on the benches opposite have to accept that as a consequence of their action tonight.
We now go back to Catherine West.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And could I say what a pleasure it is to follow the member for Argyll and Bute, who's wearing a navy suit and a navy tie with white dots on it, just like our favourite football manager, Mr. Southgate. I'm very proud to stand on my promise today, laid out in the manifesto of each of the political parties in the House, for the UK government to spend 0.7% of gross national income on the world's poorest. The UK's economy and health have been ravaged by COVID. And in my local authority area alone, COVID has led to many, many deaths and the loss of jobs. Haringey Borough has one of the highest numbers of workers on furlough and at risk of joblessness in the autumn. And child poverty is on the increase. However, my constituents care deeply about the work the UK does across the globe, especially in Africa. They do not wish to see so many girls lacking in education. They do not wish to see more infants die from malaria. And they do not wish to see Daesh prosper from the withdrawal of important civil society programs promoting stability across North Africa. This decision today will affect the UK's regional universities as well. For example, it could inhibit the important work that is done to strengthen health systems across the globe by working with doctors and nurses through the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, or the important scientific work carried out to make insecticide-treated anti-malarial bed nets through Durham University research capacity. The Prime Minister claims to support British science, but this motion suggests the opposite. We know that in 2021, there were 23 more billionaires who reached the Times Rich list. Inequality is worsening day by day, and this proposal fails to address the grotesque inequality across the globe. If I thought by agreeing with the government today it would instead fund summer schools for children in my constituency, or would mean reinstating the 5,000 mental health beds withdrawn since 2010, or it would fund the capital needed on social homes to fund home housing services for those in housing need, I would change my mind. Instead, this motion is the beginning of more austerity, the £20 cut to universal credit recipients, the potential breaking of the triple lock for pensioners, and further cuts to local government. The last 10 years has brought the country to its knees and weakened health systems and society. So when COVID reached our shores, we fell like flies. When will we learn that the government must act to protect and build defences, or else we will suffer even more?
Mangnall.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I start by thanking the government, because they have been courteous in having the Prime Minister and indeed the Chancellor both present and respond to this debate. They have been courteous in holding a vote at long last. But I'm afraid that is where my thanks end. As we have heard in the course of this debate, this was not only a manifesto commitment by every political party in this place, it was also a commitment to the world's poorest. It was a commitment to join in force with other nations around the world. And many members in this House have said that we didn't do anything, no other country followed us. But Germany, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Luxembourg all now fulfil the 0.7% target. France next year is set to hit the 0.7% target. The United States of America has uplifted its spending by $16 billion. And we say that we didn't have influence, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, I beg to differ. What we are debating today is really about the fight for parliamentary engagement. What this House voted on in 2015 in the Development Act, which enshrined the right to make sure that we weren't making short-term decisions, to make sure that when the good years were good, the spending went up, and when the bad years were bad, the spending went down, something that we should have kept in mind before we made today's decision. Instead, Madam Deputy Speaker, what we have been offered is a mirage. What looks like a compromise is something that will never be reached. It is an issue that, despite the arbiters of the OBR, the spending decisions will still be made by the Treasury. And this announcement comes before a spending review. So we don't know how much is going to be spent on social care, on health, on education. We don't know what the financial commitments will be of the government in the years to come. And therefore we are being led down the garden path. And for that, Madam Deputy Speaker, I am appalled. Like Gordon Brown's checklist to join the euro, we will never meet these targets. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a short-termist approach. I have seen the value, as has many of members in this House, of what we spend in foreign aid, whether it is women's education, whether it is on AIDS programmes, whether it is de-radicalisation, whether it is on climate change. I believe passionately that the UK leads by example in these areas. And for that, I will not apologise for voting against the government tonight. I will not apologise for the fact that I will be standing up on behalf of the NGOs and the experts who are based in the UK, who operate around the world, who lead by example and help other organisations follow suit. For that, Madam Deputy Speaker, I offer no apology. But I remind members of this House that we make an extraordinary impact in the world. And to shirk it for a short-term decision is something that we should all be appalled by.
Jardine.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for an excellent speech. Madam Deputy Speaker, 22 years ago I visited a hospital in sub-Saharan Africa where a woman who was about the same age as I was then was being treated for AIDS. When I say treated, I'm stretching the definition to breaking point. She was receiving aspirin, and I felt totally helpless. That visit was part of a professional trip to write about the work being done by an international Christian charity, but it was part of a much more important journey for me. My once carefully protected eyes had long before been open to the poverty in the world, but on that trip and others, I came to realise the significance of the international aid the UK government provides, both in creating a stable international community and making a real difference to the lives of the people who need it most. The Prime Minister earlier highlighted the work that this government is doing as part of the global response to the pandemic, and yes, we are. But these cuts are being made at a time when ministers have often cited that no country is safe until the virus is under control in every country. The same applies to international aid. The world is in the grip of insecurity and democracies are under threat. Long-term strategic support is key to building resilience and capacity in places like Myanmar. By reducing our support, power vacuums will be filled by countries like Russia and China with very different agendas to ours. China has their 500 Confucius Institutes across 140 countries with plans for 1,000 more, and they are increasing their global presence through education and culture as part of a strategy of having boots on the ground, their boots on the ground, education and soft power. And where are we? Withdrawing from the international stage, cutting the international aid budget, leaves the British Council some £10 million short. It's led to 20 offices being closed. Global Britain? How? If we blunt the very tool which delivers and embodies that ideal. So instead of saying, look, what we're doing isn't that great, what we see in the world around us should be driving us on to do more, underline how important it is, make us determined to fight to save children from starving and girls being abused, to help protect and enhance their health, their rights and their democracies, because we do have the ability. And the government reassures us this is a temporary measure. But the definition of that measure is, frankly, the height of cynicism and heartlessness. I
thank her for giving way, and she will have spent time knocking on doors in Cheshire and Amersham as I did. Is that characterisation of the new Tory party exactly what many of those voters were saying was why they were turning away from the Tories in that election and voted Lib Dem instead?
I thank the honourable member for a comment, and yes, it was, as we have heard from other honourable members today, and those same people will know that more than 2 billion people in this world do not have access to clean water, and that cutting aid will make it more difficult to change that. The rate of HIV infection across the world remains at 1.7 million people in 2019 alone. The leading killer of women of reproductive age is AIDS. When I visited that hospital 22 years ago, I felt helpless. I feel the same today. But my government can help. This government can help. And tonight, I will be voting to remind them that they should.
Mark Harper.
I'm grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker. I listened very carefully to many of the speeches that have been made today, and many of them focus on the promise that was in our manifesto about aid spending. That's entirely correct, Madam Deputy Speaker. But as I said in one of my interventions, we also made commitments to not borrow money for day-to-day spending. We also made commitments to reduce our debt burden. All of those commitments have been made more challenging by the global pandemic that we have faced. And what the Treasury has put forward today, which I will be supporting, and I hope all of my colleagues will, is an attempt to deal with the challenge from the pandemic and deliver on all of our manifesto commitments in the way that we're now going to have to reflect the reality of what's happened over the last year. Now, I've also heard many members talk about the borrowing that we've had to make over the last year. And I know the Chancellor, and I am very proud of that borrowing because it's helped us get through what has been an incredibly difficult year. But one-off borrowing for a crisis isn't the same as ongoing day-to-day spending. And I have to say I'm surprised by many of my colleagues who talk about the £5 billion a year that it would cost to replace this spending as if £5 billion wasn't a lot of money. I can remember, Madam Deputy Speaker, many difficult conversations when I was a minister and indeed when I was Government Chief Whip about far smaller sums of money, sometimes involving many of the colleagues that I've heard talk about £5 billion as if it were nothing. And I'm afraid we are going to have to get used to the fact that there are certain realities in the world, that money that we spend has to be paid for. It's either got to be borrowed or financed from taxation. And one of the problems we've now got with the borrowing we've had to make over the last year is we're now very vulnerable to increases in inflation or interest rates. I heard someone say we're living in an era of low interest rates. Well, we don't know how long that's going to last. And a 1% rise in inflation and interest rates would cost us £25,000 million, which would be 5 times the level of amount of money we're arguing about today. And those are the realities that not just the Chancellor has to grapple with, but all of us in this Parliament, and particularly those of us in the governing party. My final point, Madam Deputy Speaker, is just to say to my colleagues, this debate, I fear, is going to be repeated many times as we move through the comprehensive spending route. We're all going to have to face very difficult challenges. Yep. Governing is about choosing. It's about setting priorities about what we think is important. This is important, but so is keeping the fiscal measures on balance, and all of them are important, and I'm glad the Chancellor's brought forward the measures he has today.
I'm sorry we haven't been able to get more speakers in, but we now have to move to the roundups. Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This government says global Britain is at the heart of how we engage with the world. But this move to unilaterally cut overseas aid is a direct attack on what it means to be global Britain. It is a decision that will reduce our power, it will reduce our influence in the world, and it will undermine our security here at home. At this moment, perhaps more than at any other, we should be looking to project our power and influence for good around the world, to create change in our national interest, but in the global interest too. I am proud, we should all be proud, in this House and across our great nations, of what we've achieved together through overseas aid. Because together we have pushed polio to the verge of eradication. Together we have improved water and sanitation for more than 1.5 million people. Together we have reduced maternal and infant mortality, as my right honourable friend, the member for East Ham, spoke of. And together we have ensured that girls in the poorest places in the world can go to school, as we all take for granted that our daughters and granddaughters can go to school. Yet today the government seeks to undo that great progress. Instead of being a global leader, this government seeks to retreat on the international stage. And I can see the understandable discomfort that this is causing for honourable and right honourable members on the benches opposite, who know that the consequences of this decision and the short-sightedness of what the Prime Minister has said and what the Chancellor, I fear, will go on to say today, will mean. In particular, I want to commend the contributions today of the Right Honourable Member for Sutton Coldfield, who advised colleagues to beware the traps set for the unwary. My right honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central, who said that this motion today is just not who we are as a people. And the right honourable member for Houghton, Price and Howden, who says, when it is a choice between lives and money, I choose lives. And the reason that there has been a consensus from 5 previous Prime Ministers, including the Right Honourable Lady, the member for Maidenhead, across both parties, on the importance of the 0.7% commitment, is because the case for overseas aid expresses both our moral responsibilities that we have and because it is firmly in the national interest too. I'll give way briefly.
Thank you, Shadow Minister, for giving way. One of the NGOs and trusts that I would be involved with is the Halo Trust. They're the organisation who clear mines, unexploded ordnance and IEDs. If it comes to giving money to one group, there's a group that saves lives, as the Honourable Lady refers to.
Yeah. I thank the Honourable Gentleman for that intervention. He speaks powerfully of what he has seen. What has guided former Prime Ministers and Ministers is a moral compass. And I ask honestly to the Chancellor, what moral compass guides the Prime Minister and government ministers today as we cut those lifelines of support, and in the midst of a global pandemic as well? Now, for several decades, we have recognised that the world is increasingly interdependent, that overseas aid helps tackle poverty and infectious diseases, it helps tackle climate change, reduces conflict and terrorism, and the need for people to flee their own countries and seek refuge elsewhere. A point that the Chancellor himself made in 2015, arguing that the government's commitment to international aid is a tangible example of leadership. Well, Mr. Speaker, where is that leadership today? Because crucially, overseas aid helps us respond to pandemics. COVID cannot be eliminated anywhere if it is not eliminated everywhere. And these cuts will impede the ability for some of the poorest countries in the world to mobilise their public health systems and roll out this vaccine effectively. What good does that do any of us here? Until COVID is under control globally, the risk is that this virus mutates and it comes back to Britain and threatens all of us, including those who have already been double vaccinated. Now, the Chancellor knows full well that our country's commitments are as a proportion of our gross national income, and that is right. And it means that as our economy grows, our generosity as a country grows. But as our economy shrinks, so does our generosity to those in the poorest parts of the world. That is right, and it happens automatically without the cuts that are being proposed on top of that. As the Right Honourable Gentleman for East Worthing and Shoreham puts it, the simplicity of the 0.7% commitment is built into the formula. Our payments go up in times of plenty and they fall back when the economy is more stretched. But with a 30% reduction, that's what we're talking of today, a 30% reduction in just 1 year. Never has our aid budget been cut so savagely, so suddenly, and by so much. And let us be very clear about the tests for returning to 0.7% of GNI spent on overseas aid. The second test that the Chancellor has set out is around our debt to GDP ratio falling. Now, the OBR forecasts that this won't be met next year or the year after. At the very earliest, it will be met in the financial year 24-25. But let's look at the first test. In the last 30 years, the current budget balance test being proposed by the Chancellor today has only been met 5 times, and only for 1 year under a Conservative government. But the test proposed by the Chancellor, it goes further than that, because it doesn't just say a current budget balance, it says a sustainable current budget balance. And that is something that has only been met in the last 30 years under a Labour government. So if the Chancellor's small print conditions are applied to the latest OBR forecasts, then we will not be achieving a current budget surplus in the whole of the forecast period. These aren't tests to go back to 0.7% of GNI spent on overseas aid, but to stop that ever happening under a Conservative government again. So let us be clear about what we are voting for this evening. If we vote for the Chancellor's proposal today, this won't just be for a year. It will hang over us for as long as the Conservatives are in government. Mr. Speaker, if the Chancellor is serious about saving money, and I believe in value for money in every pound of taxpayers' money spent, then why, Mr. Speaker, did the Chancellor happily sign off cheques? £2.6 million on a media briefing room that won't be properly used. £200 million on a vanity yacht project to sell global Britain around the world. Well, why not invest that money on overseas aid instead? £37 billion on a test and trace system that doesn't even work. And £2 billion on crony contracts for friends and donors of the Conservative Party. What exactly does it say about the priorities of this government? And why is the overseas aid budget being singled out for cuts by this government? Because it is ideological, it is not about value for money. If this is what goes through this evening, and this is what the House votes for, it will diminish Britain. It will reduce our power and influence for good in the world. And it will undermine our security here at home too. This isn't just about how much aid we give overseas. It's about the country that we are and the country that we want to be. Whether you're a government or a football team, when you're on the world stage, how you conduct yourself and whether you lead by example really matters. Many honourable and right honourable members on this side and opposite too know in their hearts, but in their heads too, that what the government is proposing is profoundly wrong. And they also know full well that it breaks the proud promises that we all made at the last election just 18 months ago, not just for the crisis, but for as long as the Conservatives are in government. So I urge honourable and right honourable members to reject this motion today and do what they know is right for the poorest people in the world and to honour those proud commitments that we all made in the national interest.
Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to members on all sides for their passionate and principled contributions to today's debate. And given the short time available, let me just highlight some of the powerful speeches we've heard in support of the government's motion today, including from the honourable members for Somerton and Frome, Hitchin and Harpenden, Rutland, Derbyshire Dales, Rushcliffe and Wellingborough. Now, of course, Mr. Speaker, I am disappointed that not all of my colleagues feel able to support the government today, including the right honourable member for Maidenhead. And of course, nobody can doubt the sincere commitment to this cause by the right honourable member for Sutton Coldfield. And I'm grateful to the honourable member for Tonbridge and Malling for his kind words about my career before being in this place. There were particularly thoughtful speeches, Mr. Speaker, from the members, or the right honourable members for Tunbridge Wells and Kenilworth and Southam, both of whom highlighted the explicit provisions in the 2015 Act that envisaged these circumstances happening. I can give the right honourable member for Tunbridge Wells my commitment to the £22 billion, which I believe very strongly in, as does the Prime Minister. We are determined to create a science superpower in this country. As ever, my right honourable friend, the member for Forest of Dean, made a powerful speech about our promises, Mr. Speaker, all our promises, not just some. And whilst the party opposite may not be concerned with promises about managing the public finances and responsibly looking after people's money, people on this side of the House always will, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before I begin, may I also pay tribute to those members who have worked with the government, and I'm grateful for their constructive cooperation over the past few weeks in finding what I believe is a genuine compromise to bring this House together so that we can support a policy which commands, I think, the broad acceptance not just of this place, but of the British people. Those right honourable members and honourable members include the members for Stafford, Bromley and Chislehurst, Milton Keynes North, South Northamptonshire, and Bexhill and Battle. I am very grateful to them for all their engagement. Mr. Speaker, what we are asking the House to vote for today is a roadmap for returning to 0.7%. This roadmap reaffirms our values whilst recognising the reality that COVID has caused severe damage to our public finances. It puts beyond doubt that the reduction in the aid budget is temporary. It defines a reasonable set of tests for when we will return to 0.7, and it makes those tests objective and verifiable based on data, not dates, measured not by the government ourselves, but by the independent OBR. I'm happy to give way.
Grateful for the Chancellor giving way. Does he accept that in areas of instability and potential social decline, when you withdraw aid and you withdraw support, they are more likely to end up needing the support of our military? We know this for fact because we've had to do it a lot in the past. Does he not accept the principle that in areas that are extremely volatile, it is much, much cheaper to the British purse to support via aid workers than to send the military in with hardware and to put our soldiers in the front line, often in danger?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it is not either or. This government is doing both. We are one of the largest donors to the UN peacekeeping operations, and is why we are making a difference in countries across the globe, not just through our ODA budget, but through all the other ways we express global leadership.
I'm extremely grateful to the right honourable for giving way. He's right. The countries with big hearts also need clear heads. So will he confirm that with the roadmap he set out today and the proposals before this House, we will still be spending 20% more than we were when the party opposite was last in government on overseas aid?
If my numbers are right, Mr. Speaker, as a percentage of GDP, we were for the last few years spending double what the party opposite ever spent when they were in office, and he is right about what we will be doing even at this reduced level. But, Mr. Speaker, let me make some progress. Today's approach is a pragmatic approach to meet our commitments to the world's poorest today and have the secure fiscal foundations we need to meet those commitments for decades to come. Mr. Speaker, we should be proud of what UK overseas aid means to millions of the world's poorest people. It means tens of millions of girls around the world getting a better education. It means food parcels stamped with a Union Jack arriving in famine-stricken countries like Syria and Somalia. It means wind turbines, solar panels and hydroelectric dams generating clean energy in developing countries. And I am proud, as I know the whole House will be proud, of the extraordinary good this country is doing around the world.
Grateful to the Chancellor, and would he remind the House, who rightly very keen that we save as many lives as possible, that this country has given a great gift to the world with many free vaccines and pioneering the cheapest and one of the best vaccines to save lives all around the world.
I completely agree with my right honourable friend, and I will come on to that in a minute. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud too of our response to last year's economic crisis, the deepest recession this country has ever seen. In total, we've provided hundreds of billions of pounds to protect jobs, keep businesses afloat and help families get by. That was the right approach, but we should be clear-eyed. COVID has severely damaged our public finances. The highest level of borrowing since World War II. National debt of £2 trillion and rising, debt expected to peak at 100% of GDP. And if we want to continue to meet our commitments in the future, both at home and overseas, we must act now to rebuild our fiscal resilience. And in spite of, I'll give way one last time.
Also the Chancellor are giving way. All of this is all well and good, but they'd already taken the decision to scrap the Department for International Development before COVID came along. That's how committed they were to international aid.
On the contrary, Mr. Speaker, this government has brought a coherence, a strategic symmetry to our approach to international development and foreign policy, which is improving how we project our influence and effectiveness around the world. But I must make progress, Mr. Speaker. I've heard that this is the only difficult thing that we are apparently doing. That is simply not true. We have had to build fiscal resilience and have asked businesses to pay more tax. We have frozen the personal income tax allowance, taken a targeted approach to public sector pay, and yes, we also had to take the difficult decision to temporarily reduce our aid budget. And this decision follows a path Parliament explicitly envisaged when it enshrined the 0.7% target in law. Section 2, subsection 3 of the 2015 Act clearly foresaw the fiscal circumstances that might mean the target could not be met. And Mr. Speaker, let us be honest. If that test is not being met in the aftermath of the worst economic shock in 300 years, surely it never will. This decision, Mr. Speaker, is categorically not a rejection of our global responsibilities. The UK will spend over £10 billion this year on overseas development. According to the latest figures, that's more as a proportion of our national income than all but 2 of the G7 countries, more than Japan, Canada, Italy, and the United States, and much more than the average of the 29 countries in the OECD's Development Assistance Committee. But our spending on humanitarian causes goes far beyond just our ODA budget. We have the 4th biggest defence and security budget in the world, the 3rd largest diplomatic network. On average, we contribute nearly £500 million a year to the UN peacekeeping budget. We use our trade policy to reduce poverty, with developing countries benefiting from tariff savings of up to £1 billion a year. It's why we're working with the G7 to deliver the Clean and Green Infrastructure Financing Initiative, and with UK government support, this year 1.5 billion people around the world will be vaccinated with the Oxford AstraZeneca jab, provided at no profit whatsoever. So, Mr. Speaker, there is no question of our commitment to overseas aid. The only question is when we return to the 0.7% target. The motion before the House puts beyond all doubt that we will do so once two clear objective tests have been met. Our national debt is falling and we are no longer borrowing for day-to-day spending. These tests are in line with the approach set out in our manifesto and at budget. They are practical and realistic. Mr. Speaker, if the House votes against the motion today, this is an effective vote. We will return, irrespective of the circumstances, to 0.7 next year. Instead of voting for responsibility, the House would in effect be voting to say no circumstances could ever justify a move. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I know a deep sense of conscience underpins the view that the amount we spend on overseas aid is a moral issue. Many in this House will know the words, charity is patient, is kind. I think of those words and I share that sense of conscience. That is why we are maintaining the target, not abolishing it. That's why we are setting out the conditions, not obscuring. We are basing the conditions independently.
Order. The question is, as on the order paper, as many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No! Aye. Division, clear the lobbies. Are you both ready? Quick and okay. The question is, as on the order paper, as many of that opinion. Order. Let's sit down, please. The question is, as on the order paper, as many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. No. The tellers for the ayes are David Rutley and Maria Coalfield. For the noes, I've got it the wrong way round. For the tellers for the ayes are Jessica Morden and Anthony Magdal. For the noes are David Rutley. No, the ayes. I was right first time. I was right first time. Somebody said I wasn't. I was. Right. For the ayes are David Rutley and Maria Coalfield. For the noes, Jessica Morden and Anthony Magdal. Thank you. Lock the doors!
Wait. Yep.
Order.
The ayes to the right, 333. The noes to the left, 298.
The ayes to the right, 333. The noes to the left, 298. The ayes have it, a lock. Chancellor, point of order.
Mr. Speaker, I recognise the passion and conviction with which many members spoke today in favour of the 0.7% target, members who voted both for and against the government's motion, in fact. And to me, that is the salient point, Mr. Speaker. Whilst not every member felt able to vote for the government's compromise, the substantive matter of whether we remain committed to the 0.7% target, not just now, but for decades to come, is clearly a point of significant unity in this House. Today's vote has made that commitment more secure for the long term, whilst helping the government to fix the problems with our public finances and continue to deliver for our constituents today. I want to commit to the House, Mr. Speaker, that both I and the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary will continue to work with all honourable members on how we can continue to be a global leader helping the world's poorest, on how to improve our aid spending, target it most effectively, and ensure that it is getting to those who need it most. And Mr. Speaker, having now provided the House with an effective vote on this matter, the government will move forward with its planned approach.
I now suspend the House for 2 minutes to enable the necessary arrangements to be made for the next business. Order.
Order. Order. Point of order, Sir Christopher Chope.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I hope you can help us, because in the debate after this one, we are discussing the regulations which the government has brought forward, which will deprive thousands of people who work in our care homes of the right to work and not give them any compensation. The government said on the 22nd of June that alongside the statutory instrument, it was laying an explanatory memorandum together with an impact assessment. The impact assessment has not been laid. Yesterday I raised this as an issue, and I referred to the fact that the department had written to the library and said the impact assessment has not been laid yet. We will be laying it at the earliest opportunity. That was midday yesterday. I've recently spoken to people in the vote office, and they say that they've now been informed by the department that this impact assessment will not be laid before the debate. So either it doesn't exist and there was a falsehood when it asserted that it did exist, or it's been suppressed because it doesn't fit in with the government's agenda. But in any event, Madam Deputy Speaker, is it open to you to put pressure on the government to withdraw that item of business until we have got an impact assessment?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his point of order and for giving me advance notice of it. No, I can't ask the government to withdraw the motion, and the business statement has been agreed to. But I do share the honourable gentleman's disappointment that this document has not been made available for the debate after this one, and I hope it will be fed back from the Treasury bench that the Minister will address the issue in her remarks in the debate. Thank you. Further to that point of order, William Ragg.
That point of order, having recently been on an all-colleague call with the Care Minister, she confirmed to us that the said impact assessments would not be made available until after the vote. That strikes me as a rather back-to-front approach. So just to provide that clarity to the House.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable member for that clarity. It is what we rather suspected. I was trying to hint at that it wasn't going to be ready, but that the Minister would address it in her remarks when she opens the debate. Thank you. Sir Christopher Chope.
What my honourable friend has said, that this is available. It could be made available immediately, but the government is choosing not to make it available until after the event.
Well, the honourable gentleman has reinforced his point that if it is available, could it be made available before the debate? We understand it is not going to be, but as I say, we will pass back the very strong feeling that the Minister should address why that is the case in her opening remarks. Right, we now move on to the Armed Forces Bill Programme number 3 motion. Programme motion, Minister to move.
I beg to move.
The question is the Armed Forces Bill Programme number 3 motion as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it, the ayes have it. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Armed Forces Bill as amended in committee to be considered.
Now. Thank you. We begin with new clause 1, with which it will be convenient to consider the other selected new clauses and amendments as listed on the selection paper, and I call Shadow Minister Stephanie Peacock to move new clause 1.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Labour stands firmly behind our armed forces and our brave service personnel who serve our country. It is a privilege to be speaking on behalf of Her Majesty's opposition on this important piece of legislation. From their work across the country on the front line of the pandemic to operations around the world, Britain's armed forces deserve our admiration and gratitude. My granddad, who would have been 100 this year, served with the RAF during the Second World War. Nearly all of us will have loved ones whose service we look back upon with pride, and I'm sure that we would all hope that they were given the support that they needed and which they deserved during their service and afterwards. Labour supports our armed forces and the principles behind this bill. It is a once-in-a-Parliament opportunity to bring about meaningful improvements to the lives of our service personnel, veterans and their families. And I want to take this opportunity to thank all the organisations who have contributed to this piece of legislation: local authorities, service charities and voluntary organisations. It is the duty of any and every government to look after its people. And there are welcome steps within this bill which we are supportive of: the creation of a legal duty to the principles of the Covenant and the implementation of key elements of the Lyons Review. But we believe the government can and should go further. Our forces communities cannot afford for this bill to become a missed opportunity. And that's why Labour have put forward our amendments in good faith, to strengthen this bill and offer support and protection that are needed by many of our service personnel. So turning firstly to Amendment 1. Currently, serious crimes, including murder, manslaughter, domestic violence, child abuse and rape cases that are committed in the UK by service personnel are prosecuted in the service justice system, the SJS, and not the civilian courts. Victims and their families often don't get the justice they deserve, and quite often sexual abuse cases are tried as disgraceful conduct and other service offences, meaning that those who commit the offences are not put on the sex offenders register. I will give way, yes.
Grateful for the Shadow Minister for giving way, and very much welcome her commitment to the rule of law in Amendment 1. Almost 50 years ago, 14 unarmed civil rights marchers were murdered on the streets of Derry by the Parachute Regiment. 5 of those victims were shot by David Cleary, otherwise known as Soldier F. For 50 years, he's been granted anonymity. Now the government want to give him an amnesty. Does the Shadow Minister agree with me that none of the perpetrators involved in murder during our Troubles should be granted an amnesty?
Well, the Labour Party is committed to the Stormont House Agreement, and the leader of the Labour Party, the member for Holborn and St Pancras, made clear in Northern Ireland last week that the rule of law must be central to our approach to legacy in Northern Ireland. Returning now to Amendment number 1. Last week I met with the charity Saluta at Forward Assist, who shared with me statistics that show up to 6 out of 10 women serving in the military have experienced some form of sexual harassment or abuse. This is an issue that disproportionately affects women of lower ranks. It is a harrowing issue, and these women deserve real justice. This amendment would ensure that the Armed Forces Bill provides appropriate support, protection and access to justice for our forces. Serious crimes will be tried in the civilian courts when committed in the UK unless the Attorney General has consented for such crimes to be tried under courts martial. I would now like to move to Amendment 2. A significant part of this bill relates to the Armed Forces Covenant and the introduction of legal duty for public bodies to have regard to its principles. I'm proud that my own local authority, Barnsley Council, are not only one of the leading signatories of the Covenant, but have also achieved the Gold Award in the Defence Employer Recognition Scheme. More needs to be done to end the postcode lottery support, and introducing the legal duty in this bill is a welcome step. But we believe it can go further, not only in the duties themselves, currently limited to healthcare, housing and education, but whom they apply to as well. Whilst this bill creates new responsibilities for a wide range of public bodies, from school governors to local authorities, central government is not included. The government is notable by its omission from these legal responsibilities. They should show leadership in at least holding themselves to the same standard that they are asking others to follow. Our amendment would place the same legal responsibilities to the Armed Forces Covenant on central government as their current drafting requires of local authorities. 12 of the UK's leading military charities wrote an open letter to MPs last week, sharing their concern that the new legal duties in the bill do not cover the full range of issues currently affecting our armed forces community. They are urging the government to widen the bill's scope to make sure greater protections are given in areas such as employment, pensions, social care and immigration. I hope the government will today listen to those charities and support our amendment. Through new Clause 1, we are calling on the Ministry of Defence to recognise its duty of care to British service personnel who are subject to legal action arising from overseas operations. It simply cannot be right that so many families have been put through the trauma of long-running investigations with little to no legal or welfare support from the Ministry of Defence. Labour repeatedly attempted to resolve this issue with amendments to the Overseas Operations Bill, but ministers did not accept this important duty as part of the bill. We are asking the government again to reconsider this issue and ensure they deliver on their responsibilities to members of our armed forces. New Clause 2 would establish a comprehensive review of the number of people who were dismissed or forced to resign from the armed forces due to their sexuality and consider appropriate forms of compensation. The institutional and cultural discrimination against the LGBT+ community is frankly a shameful feature of our not-so-distant past and remains a serious issue today. I am proud that the last Labour government abolished the ban on homosexuality in the armed forces in 2000, and I believe the government's new policy of medal restoration for those veterans is a very welcome first step. But it simply cannot be right that so little further work has been undertaken to seek to right this wrong. So we ask ministers to now consider the restoration of ranks, pensions and other form of compensation to appropriately honour those who have served our country with courage and distinction, irrespective of their sexuality. New Clause 3 is calling on the government to create a representative body for our armed forces. It has been clear for some time now that the armed forces need independent advice. There are many issues where members of the armed forces need representation in matters such as welfare and pay, which is why Labour are calling for a representative body for the armed forces to work with the Ministry of Defence to further support service personnel. The US and Australia already have similar models embedded into military command structures, and the model is used successfully in this country in the police force through the Police Federation. Our armed forces give their lives for us. Ministers should seize this opportunity to give them a real voice. And finally, I will turn to New Clause 4, which calls on the government to conduct a formal review of the standards of mental health care available for service personnel. The government is currently missing a range of targets for mental health care for people who have served. Forces personnel face a wait of 37 days for a face-to-face appointment to be offered through the Transition, Intervention and Liaison Service, against a target of 14 days. That is a wait of more than double the target time period. They then face another unacceptable wait for treatment. The latest figures available to us show an average wait time for treatment of 70 days, and that is a jump up from 57 days in 2018-19. After 6 months of having left the service, veterans then access mental health support through the responsibilities of the NHS, which of course themselves face serious pressures and considerable waiting times. Ministers cannot ignore this issue or seek to outsource accountability and responsibility on matters such as these. Action needs to be taken nationally to deliver this, and we believe the review established by New Clause 4 would form a key basis for turning around the crisis in mental health services. So there are welcome steps in this bill, but in delivering on the special responsibility that we have to our armed forces personnel, we believe the government can and should go further with this legislation. Labour believes the Armed Forces Covenant represents a binding moral commitment between the government and our service communities, and this legislation is an opportunity to strengthen and improve it, and through Labour's amendments to go further and to ensure we tackle all areas of disadvantage. Thank you.
Yeah. Duty of care to service personnel.
The question is that New Clause 1 be read a second time. James Sunderland.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a great pleasure to follow the new Shadow Minister, and I wish her well in her new role. I also empathise with much of what she said this afternoon, but of course the government position is quite different, and I'll explain why. As chair of the Armed Forces Bill Select Committee, I'm probably more familiar with this bill than most, and it is a good bill. And as before with the Armed Forces Covenant, I welcome the fact that it places a due regard on the placeholder, that it recognises rightful outcomes, accurately reflects unique sacrifices and obligations on HM forces, and it places a legal obligation on the delivery of health, accommodation and local support from councils. It provides examples of good practice and pragmatic guidelines for how this is to be provided. I note, and with the Minister in his place, that prescriptive performance targets are still absent from the statutory guidance, but it may just be impossible to apply any meaningful metrics and tools to this area and I just do not believe that councils are in any doubt of what is expected of them after 10 years. But it may be that guidance is still needed on how they will be held to account if they do not meet their obligations. So I do await that with interest. On to the amendments, if I may, and I just want to talk to a handful. New Clause 1, as mentioned, the duty of care new clause, would require the Secretary of State to establish a duty of care standard in relation to legal, pastoral and mental health support provided to service personnel involved in investigations or litigation arising from overseas operations. While this duty of care is one of the most important aspects of the bill, and the armed forces, of course, applying a one-size-fits-all approach could lead to difficulties in the future, tailored welfare and mental support for those who have served is already very effective and already offered to all personnel. On to new clause 2, dismissal for sexuality. This requires the government to conduct a comprehensive review of the number of people who are dismissed or forced to resign from the armed forces due to their sexuality or perceived sexuality, and to make recommendations on appropriate forms of compensation. Well, as before, while there is no validation to this practice and the government does see it as an absolute wrong, the government has resisted this clause at this point in time, and indeed at the committee stage, due to it complicating the MOD's efforts to address at pace this injustice. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, for the record, this does need to be done in due course, and I believe that the government will do it. On to new clause 3, representative armed forces body. This would create a representative body for the armed forces akin to a police federation, which would represent their members in matters such as welfare, pay and efficiency. But, once again, the government has not been persuaded that there is a requirement or a groundswell of support for a federation along the lines that have been suggested. The interests of armed forces personnel, of which I was one, are already represented ably through a range of mechanisms, not least the chain of command. Furthermore, the Service Complaints Ombudsman provides independent and impartial scrutiny of all service complaints. I want to talk to some of the amendments if I can, but actually my opinion on all of them is the same as it is for the new clauses. Whilst they are laudable on their own, there is good reason why the government is resisting every one, for reasons that have been outlined at length during both the committee stage and indeed during the select committee stage. So, Mr. Speaker, in the interest of time, this bill has been subject to repeated scrutiny at various stages. It is a good bill, remains fit for purpose in terms of what can be achieved now, and I'll be voting it through tonight. Thank you.
We now go to the SNP spokesperson, Carol Monaghan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I wish to start my comments this afternoon by paying tribute to members of the armed forces, both in ordinary times, the work they do in ordinary times, but also the work they have done over the last 15, 16 months in their support for services during the pandemic. I also want to pay tribute to organisations who have taken time to engage with members during the passage of this bill to ensure that we are fully informed in as many areas and as wide a range of issues as possible. This bill started its passage with members on all sides keen to see real change for personnel in the armed forces. And from that start, with the very best of intentions, we've ended up with a disappointing conclusion, with non-controversial amendments being rejected without, I believe, any real attempt to make meaningful progress. Therefore, we find ourselves with a bill now at the stage that will make very little, if any, practical difference to those who serve. Of course, I do hope that I'm proved wrong in this, but I have my suspicions that in a year's time, if we were to ask personnel, do they know of any difference that this has made, the answer, unfortunately, would be negative. I've made it clear throughout the passage of this bill it lacks the punch required. The bill's commitment to the Armed Forces Covenant falls far short of what it ought to be. Many stakeholders, including the Royal British Legion, have argued that the bill should go further in strengthening the Covenant and law. But many other areas have been missed out, such as visas for Commonwealth personnel, pay, DWP issues, and proper representation for serving personnel. The veterans who've suffered humiliation, dismissal and loss of pensions because of their sexuality, this bill simply does not deliver. And I know the Armed Forces Minister has previously spoken of his intention to make real progress in this area. I look forward to working with him to deliver a just outcome for those individuals that have been affected in this way. Because this is a real example of an issue that this bill fails to address. And SNP will be supporting Labour's new clause 2 on this. Armed Forces Minister has previously given us assurances on service accommodation, but accommodation issues are raised year on year by serving personnel. And the recent National Audit Office report on single living accommodation describes a litany of neglect, and accommodation for families also falls far short of the standards we would expect. So it is disappointing that the bill as it stands will not strengthen the accommodation offer. The SNP series of modest amendments, that's Amendments 3 to 6, asks that service accommodation matches the standards set for civilian housing. This should be a matter of straightforward agreement across the House. We should not be asking service personnel or indeed their families to put up with accommodation that would be deemed unacceptable to non-military families. If we're talking about non-detriment, basic housing standards should be a good place to start. I'm not expecting the government to accept SNP amendments on this today, but I hope this issue can be properly considered in the weeks and months ahead. The SNP has for a long time advocated a far more comprehensive way of representing the interests of the armed forces, and we look to examples from many of our NATO allies which benefit from armed forces representative bodies. We're used to hearing arguments from members of the government benches on how this could not possibly work because it could undermine a chain of command or encourage strike action. However, an armed forces representative body would be a federation like, for example, the Police Federation. It wouldn't allow strikes, wouldn't impact the chain of command, but it would give a voice to our personnel that at the moment is sadly lacking. So I'm pleased to see Labour bringing this amendment forward again. If we're looking at ensuring the covenant is properly fulfilled, such an organisation would substantively carry out that role. It would advocate on pay, housing, terms and conditions, etc. However, I think the government's real reason for resistance to this is that it would actually give our armed forces and veterans a voice. The time and effort spent on this bill should have been an opportunity to significantly improve our offerings to the armed forces, but I am doubtful. And without the ability to enforce and without the teeth this bill needs, it will fall sadly short. This is a once-in-a-parliament opportunity. Many of us will be disappointed, but the SNP will continue to engage with the government and the Armed Forces Minister in the hope that we can make a real change for those who are serving. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
We now go to David Simmons.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The substance of the bill before the House today is access to justice and the welfare and our wider responsibilities in the context of the military covenant. And in supporting this bill, I would like to draw the House's attention to the excellent work of some local authorities in supporting our service personnel and our veterans, including the many who reside in Ryslip, Northwood and Pinner as a consequence of the numerous nearby military bases, including HMS Northwood, RAF Northolt and some of the historic ones in the area. I very much commend the Honourable Member for Bracknell Forest for the work that he has done. I know he was a resident of my constituency during his army career. And I'm sure that, like me, he would commend the work of the London Borough of Hillingdon, led by our Armed Forces champion, Councillor Sir Ray Puddifoot. For many service personnel, access to housing and ensuring school places for their children can be a challenge. And Hillingdon has, through its approach to the Military Covenant, sought to make this as straightforward as possible. Its housing allocations policy enables returning service personnel to be treated as though they'd never been away from their home area, absent in service when it comes to applying for social housing. And targeted support has enabled a Gurkha community to settle and play a fantastic part in the life of the local area. And support to enable the children of service families to secure school places quickly is also prioritised, ensuring that those who serve their country do not face sacrificing their family interest. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I very much encourage the government and all those involved in the debate about this bill to highlight these examples and many others of best practice within the Military Covenant to ensure that our service personnel are treated with the priority that they deserve and which are entirely in line with the aspirations that are set out in the bill. And it seems very clear to me that many of these things are not so much matters of law nor matters of government targets, so much as ensuring that we have the relationships at a local level and the political will and the effective management so that the expectations set out in the Military Covenant, set out with local authorities, health bodies and others, are fulfilled. And I strongly encourage the government in supporting this bill to publicise the work of the best as an example that others may aspire to ensure that we all fulfil our obligations.
Kevin Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I join other members and thank the committee clerks that have supported this Armed Forces Bill and pay tribute to all the members who have taken part in it. We're on the final stage now. I was going to say then also pay tribute to the Minister's predecessor, but again, I don't think I can. He's absent again today. He's taken such an interest in this bill and stand up for veterans. He can't even be bothered to get off his beach from Devon to come and speak on their behalf when he has an opportunity to do so, but we'll leave that there, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise to support as I think I've said on a previous occasion, Madam Speaker, I think I've been on every single Armed Forces Bill in the last 20 years, either as a minister or a backbencher, and as has just been said by the Honourable Lady who speaks on behalf of the SNP, these come around every 5 years. The department is not a department which deals with much legislation, so it's very important, I think, that when we do have these 5-yearly Armed Forces Acts or bills, that we ensure we try and address all the issues that we can. And I've got to say, I'm very sad to say I don't think we have with this. It's been partly, I think, as I've said on previous occasions, to the intransigence and attitude of the previous Armed Forces Minister, and I think the new Minister has been left to pick up the pieces at the end. And one of the issues which is still not going to be, and I was tempted to put amendments down on it again today, but I thought not, was the issue around investigations, which we still are going to have outside the scope of this bill, the improvements that can be made, and outside the scope of the Overseas Operations Bill. And, you know, I would just like to ask the Minister, when the review is complete, which I understand is going to be complete later this summer, is when will that time for those amendments and changes that need to be put in place, when will it be happening? Because I don't think we can wait another 5 years for next Armed Forces Bill. And I could say, I've used the word before, members, it's a missed opportunity which would have improved this bill and certainly would have vastly improved the Overseas Operations Bill, which is a disappointment, to say the least, in terms of promising a lot and delivering little and actually taking away rights from veterans, which is disappointing. I'd like to just speak to some of the amendments before. And can I just begin with new clause 2? One of the great things about the Armed Forces Bill, the way it's constructed, we can take evidence from a wide range of individuals. And can I pay tribute to Fighting with Pride for their evidence that they gave to the Select Committee, because they demonstrated, and I think they shone a light on something which has not been highlighted, and that's the way and the effects of those individuals who were dismissed from service because of their sexuality. I think many of us thought, well, because the ban was overturned, somehow that was the end of the issue, and somehow things had moved on. But what shocked me, and I think many of the committee, was the fact that those individuals who served their country with dignity and bravery, who were then dismissed because of their sexuality, are still suffering the legacies of that, including an individual we heard evidence from who, because it was classed as a sexual offence, is on the sex offenders register, which is still today, 20 years afterwards, still affecting his ability to get a job, for example, as a school caretaker. This urgently needs to be addressed, and I don't, doubt that the Minister is committed to look at this area, but I think without this new clause in, the MOD will go into its usual mode of thinking, well, we don't need to bother about this for the next few years and how we're going to do it. But what clearly needs to be done, that study does need to be done in terms of the effects. And clearly the issue around the criminal records just needs to be addressed straight away. There's no justification at all for these individuals who have got a criminal record that if they'd, in quote, committed the same offence in same acts in civilian life would not have had a criminal record. That can't be right. Those individuals are still being. I note the government's change in terms of asking issues in terms of medals and making sure that people are being able to apply for the medals that they were stripped from them when they were dismissed from service. But I think again we need clear guidance on this. I think people have to apply. I think some people have asked about, well, why can't the MOD take a proactive stance and actually offer these medals out? And for some unknown reason, the data is not there. It makes you wonder, Madam Speaker, whether or not a hard enough job is being looked at in terms of trying to address and find out these individuals. There must be records in all three services of the individuals that were dismissed. And I think it is important that those medals are actually reported. So, as I say, I don't question the commitment of the Minister, but I think without this, he will come up against what we all do, as you know, Madam Deputy Speaker, in terms of the civil service system. This will just get pushed back, and we've got to make sure it isn't. The only way I think we can do that is by doing this. New Clause 3, in terms of the Armed Forces Federation, I know this always sets off the end of the world notions in terms of some in the military and some on the conservative backbenches, as though somehow that if we had this, the world would stop. Well, if it's good enough for our main allies into the United States, in terms of Australia, and in terms of the many European countries, then I think it's good enough to me. Now, people ask the question, well, are you arguing here for a trade union? I think the Honourable Lady for Glasgow North West was correct. This is not about having a trade union for the armed forces. And I've got to say, I understand the conservative nature of the small c of the military. But this is now coming to a point where it's going to have to come in sooner rather than later. I've, just along with other members of the Defence Select Committee, undertaken an inquiry ably chaired by the Honourable Lady for Wrexham into women in the armed forces. I'm not going to say what's in it, but when it is published, I think it's next week, I think people will be utterly shocked at the way and some of the evidence and things we've found. And one of the key points there that comes loud and clear in that report is the reluctance for people to come forward, to make complaints, the reluctance in terms of the chain of command to take some of those, we're not talking here, disputes in terms of employment. We're talking in some cases, serious cases of sexual assault and other issues which are just not being addressed. And what I consider this being is a pressure cooker in the system. You need you need something in the system to let the steam out. There's no system there at the moment. All it does, it builds up because people in the chain of command are ignoring in some cases, and there's a cultural issue which is I think still there, particularly in the army, which means that these issues and people are not being addressed. I don't see any other way of changing it rather than what would seem as a radical change. I would not support anything which meant that any type of federation would affect the operational effectiveness of our armed forces in terms of strikes. I would not go there. But what the ordinary man and woman in our armed forces today need is a voice. And frankly, I don't think they have a voice. And as I say, I think people ought to read that report, and it saddened me, frankly, that after all the changes in wider society have taken, that some of those attitudes and things are still going on. It will come around this, whether it's in the next Armed Forces Act or not, I'm not sure. But those people do need to have representation. Now, can I turn on to new clause 4, and it's around provision of mental health. And can I say is that has a lot of progress been made in this area? Quite clearly, yes, Madam Deputy Speaker. But what is happening now is the same thing that I came up when I was dealing with in the Ministry of Defence, and it's that transition and disconnect between the Ministry of Defence and the Department of Health. Now, I know the present government and I certainly tried in terms of making sure you have a joined up seamless service, but it's still not working. Veterans are still falling through the gaps in terms of provision. And the only way I think we can do that is to ensure that we actually have a seamless joined up service. Now, that's got to be patient-led, it's got to be about the individuals. And I would also just like to reiterate, I think some of the ministers said on numerous occasions, is that, I don't want to portray the average veteran as a victim, because they're not. Most of them are very active, constructive members of society who've got no problems whatsoever. But we do have that duty to actually care for individuals that don't have that positive service, positive life post-service. So what I would say in terms of these individuals is how we actually break down those barriers. And I think in terms of the proposals put forward, without having that joined up service, I don't think we're going to have a proper system, which I think we all want across the House, which is actually the best for our veterans. Can I come on to Amendment 1? People saw this morning's Times. I mean, these figures are not pretty in terms of rape and serious sexual assault. Is that an issue around lack of commitment in terms of resources? Possibly it is. I've got to say, having sat with colleagues on the Defence Select Committee in terms of the report we've just done, what saddens me that it's actually some of it's down to cultural attitudes which have no place in a modern society and do need radical change. I think the other issue here relates back to my earlier comments in terms of investigations. In terms of serious sexual assault and things like domestic violence, you can't expect the military police to actually have the level of expertise which most forces would have because the volume of cases. If you're dealing with one case a year, then your level of expertise in terms of being able to make it a priority in terms that you're actually gathering evidence and actually making sure you've got the strongest case possible is not going to be there. So I think, I'm sorry, this has got to be taken out of the actual military justice system. Now, in terms of other things I'd just like to touch on, I think the issue which I think has been throughout this is in terms of jurisdiction of where the Armed Forces Covenant, and I think in terms of the areas which have been excluded, the obvious ones that really I think for many veterans are pensions, employment, compensation, social care, criminal justice, others, which are completely excluded from this. Now, we tried in committee to work out why the government had wanted to just stick to quite a prescribed area, and I've got to say I'm not really sure. Apart from it was a good way of limiting that. But I think if we actually really want to make the covenant meaningful in practice, it's got to go wider. The other thing which I'm still not happy with this bill with is the fact that the redress system, the idea that people can take a judicial review if they're not satisfied. Now, what we needed in this bill, and which would have been the obvious thing, was actually we took evidence from the local ombudsman, the Ombudsman Service that suggested it, is people should have had the right to be able to take complaints if they've not actually got what they think is is redress to the Ombudsman, because without any redress I think this is going to be pretty meaningless. And what I wouldn't want, Madam Speaker, to see is the Armed Forces Covenant just being seen as a label which is thrown around, but actually doesn't actually do anything in practice for our veterans community. So with those remarks, Madam Speaker, I'll draw my remarks to a conclusion. But to say, is this a good bill? No, it's not really. We've missed opportunities. There were things in that I think, and to be honest, I think I'll perhaps start where I'll end where I started. I think if we'd had the present minister throughout the passage of that bill, we'd have had a lot more changes. Ministers can't be in a situation whereby they just will not accept anything, can frankly treat committee and members and colleagues with contempt, and that's not just in the opposition, that's on their own benches as well. So it's an opportunity missed. I look forward to the Minister replying, and if we've missed these opportunities now, if we have to wait another 5 years for the next bill, if I'm still a member of the House and no doubt beyond the committee, I look forward to some of those things being put in. But in the meantime, there are opportunities missed there which will affect veterans and our armed forces community.
Number 6 is withdrawn. So Jamie Stone.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I find myself making the mental note to be fairly worried if the right honourable member for North Durham was to praise me. We'll gloss over that. I too would like to extend my thanks to the Minister. I was delighted to receive a telephone call from him to discuss this a few days ago. I would have been much more surprised had I received a telephone call from his predecessor. I give credit where it's due. In our conversation, we discussed the fact that I would be very pleased, on sort of forgetting political boundaries, if he would, or one of his colleagues would care to come and witness the NATO exercise Joint Warrior, which takes place off the northwest of my constituency and in other parts of Scotland. I think it would be a tremendous shot in the arm for our military personnel to see a ministerial presence. And I don't think we've actually seen a government minister there, certainly in the lifetime of this government. I can't speak for previous governments, I was not here. It would also be churlish of me not to express my thanks to all the organisations who have been in touch with me during the whole process of this bill. We are rather short of time. I'm going to keep my comments very brief. I want to talk about two things, Madam Deputy Speaker. The first is to say that my party will be supporting Amendments 1 and 2. And I would like to talk about Amendment number 1, further to my colleague behind me. The general public doesn't really understand why, if a member of the armed forces commits a truly terrible crime, murder or rape, why that should be tried and dealt with in a different manner to